In the dusty market square of Red Hollow, New Mexico Territory, 1884, a young woman stands on a wooden platform while her own father calls out her price like she's livestock. "Barren as a salt flat," he shouts to the crowd, "but she can cook, clean, and she won't talk back." The men laugh. The women whisper behind their hands. Eliza Hart keeps her eyes on the horizon, waiting for the humiliation to end, praying for it to be over quickly. She doesn't see the silent rancher at the back of the crowd, the one whose jaw tightens with every cruel word, whose hand moves slowly toward the leather pouch at his belt. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop a comment with your city name so I can see how far this story travels. And stay with me until the end, because what happens next will break your heart open and then put it back together in ways you never expected. The September sun beat down on Red Hollow's market square like a hammer on an anvil, turning the packed dirt into fine powder that rose with every footfall and settled on everything. The vegetable carts, the horses tied to the hitching posts, the faces of the people who'd come to witness the spectacle. Eliza Hart stood on the auction platform in her faded blue dress, the only good one she owned, and felt every eye in the territory burning into her skin. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she forced them still. She'd learned long ago that showing weakness only made the wolves circle closer. "Now, I know what you're all thinking," her father, Joseph Hart, called out to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying that particular blend of false joviality and underlying desperation that made Eliza's stomach turn. "Why's Joe Hart selling his own daughter in the town square like a horse or a piece of furniture?" A few men chuckled. Eliza's mother, Martha, stood off to the side, her face a mask of righteous satisfaction. She'd been the one to insist on this. On the public sale, the humiliation, the final severing of any connection between Eliza and the family name. "Well, I'll tell you why," Joseph continued, warming to his audience now. "My daughter here was married once. Good Christian marriage to Samuel Winters, a prosperous man with land and livestock. But 3 years went by and no children came. Not one, not even a sign of one." The whispers started then, rippling through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Eliza kept her eyes fixed on the mountains in the distance, purple-blue against the horizon. If she looked at the mountains, she could almost pretend she was somewhere else. Someone else. "Samuel had the marriage annulled," her father went on. "Said she was barren as a salt flat. And you know what? He was right. My daughter can't give a man what he needs most. An heir, a legacy, someone to carry on his name. So Samuel found himself a new wife, and she gave him 2 sons in 2 years. More laughter now, sharper, meaner. Eliza felt the heat of shame creep up her neck, burning hotter than the sun. She'd heard all of this before, of course. The accusations, the blame, the casual cruelty of people who needed someone to look down on to feel better about their own lives. But hearing it shouted in a public square, announced like a defect in merchandise, cut deeper than she'd expected. "But," Joseph held up one finger, his voice rising, "that doesn't mean she's worthless. Oh no, Eliza can cook when she's not burning things. She can clean when she's not breaking things. She can sew a straight seam mostly, and she's young enough, strong enough to work hard for a man who doesn't need children. Maybe an older widower, maybe someone who just needs an extra pair of hands. Maybe someone who needs a warm body at night," someone called from the crowd, and the laughter that followed was uglier than before. Eliza's fingers curled into fists in her skirt. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. She wanted to disappear into the dust and never be seen again. But there was nowhere to run to. No one to run to. Her parents had made that clear. She was theirs to dispose of, and they'd chosen this method. Public, humiliating, final. "Now, let's be honest here," Joseph said, and his voice took on a harder edge. "I'm not asking much. She's got a stain on her name, no question about that. But she's not sick, she's not lazy, and she keeps herself clean. A man could do worse. So let's start the bidding at $50, a voice called from the back of the crowd. The square went quiet. Eliza turned her head slightly, trying to see who'd spoken, but the crowd was too thick, too many bodies between her and the voice. 50? Her father's face brightened with surprise. "Well, now that's 60, another voice cut in. This one belonged to a man Eliza recognized, Walt Granger, who owned the feed store and had buried 2 wives already. He was 60 if he was a day, with hard eyes and harder hands. Eliza had seen the bruises on his second wife's arms before she died of fever. 75, came a third voice, younger, uncertain. Joseph Hart's face was alight now, seeing profit where he'd expected pennies. Now we're getting somewhere. Do I hear 80? 80, Walt Granger again, more aggressive now. Eliza closed her eyes. This was it then. She'd be sold to the highest bidder, probably Walt Granger, and she'd spend whatever years God gave her serving a man who'd see her as less than human. She'd sleep in his bed when he wanted, cook his meals, clean his house, and bury whatever dreams she'd once had about being loved, being valued, being seen as something more than a failure and a burden. Do I hear 90? Her father called. Silence. Anyone? 80 going once? $100. The voice came from the back again, the first voice, and this time it was loud enough, clear enough that the crowd parted slightly to let the speaker through. Eliza opened her eyes. The man who walked forward wasn't what she'd expected. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and hands that looked like they could break stone. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind into hard planes and sharp angles. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, and another traced his jawline from ear to chin. His hair was dark, shot through with silver at the temples, and his eyes, when they finally met Eliza's across the square, were the color of storm clouds before rain. He wasn't old, she realized. 40, maybe. 45 at most. But he carried himself with the weight of someone who'd lived twice that many years. 100? Joseph Hart's voice cracked slightly. Sir, I don't believe we've... Cullen Reyes, the man said, and his voice was like gravel, rough and low. I have a ranch 8 miles north of here, the Broken Ridge. Recognition rippled through the crowd. Eliza had heard the name before, in whispered conversations between her parents, between townspeople at the general store. The Broken Ridge was a hard-scrabble piece of land in the high country, barely enough water to keep livestock alive, too remote for most folks to bother with. And Cullen Reyes, she'd heard his name too, always spoken with a mixture of pity and suspicion. His wife died, someone murmured nearby, left him with all those children. 5 of them, someone else added. 5 children and no woman to care for them. $100 is my offer, Cullen said, and he pulled a leather pouch from his belt and held it up. The coins inside clinked together with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. Cash. Right now. Joseph Hart's eyes gleamed. Well, Mr. Reyes, that's a generous 110, Walt Granger cut in, stepping forward. His face was red, his jaw set. I'll pay 110. Cullen Reyes didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed on Eliza, steady and unreadable. 150. The crowd gasped. Joseph Hart's mouth fell open. Even Martha, who'd maintained her expression of righteous disdain throughout the entire proceeding, looked shocked. $150? Joseph managed. Sir, that's far too much for... Then we have a deal? Cullen interrupted. For the first time, Eliza really looked at him. She'd expected to see what she'd always seen in men's eyes when they looked at her. Calculation, judgment, dismissal. But his eyes held something different, not pity exactly. Not even kindness, something harder to name, something that looked almost like anger, but not directed at her. Well, yes, I suppose... Her father was stammering now, caught between greed and confusion. Cullen walked forward, his boots striking the packed earth with deliberate steps. When he reached the platform, he tossed the pouch up to Joseph, who caught it clumsily. Then Cullen turned to Eliza and extended his hand. Ma'am, he said simply. Eliza stared at his hand. It was scarred, calloused, the hand of a man who'd worked every day of his life without complaint. The nails were clean but permanently stained with dirt and engine grease. A working hand, an honest hand. She took it. His grip was firm but not crushing. He helped her down from the platform with the same care she'd seen men use with fine china or skittish horses. Careful, deliberate, aware that the thing in their hands could break. You have anything you need to collect? He asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Eliza shook her head. Everything she owned was on her back. The blue dress, worn thin at the elbows. The shoes with holes in the soles. the small locket around her neck that had been her grandmother's, the only thing her mother hadn't taken from her. "Then we'll go." He didn't wait for her father to finish counting the money. He didn't acknowledge the stares or the whispers or Walt Granger's furious glare. He simply turned and walked back through the crowd, his hand still loosely holding Eliza's, and the people parted for him like water around a stone. At the edge of the square sat a wagon, old but well-maintained, pulled by two sturdy mules. Cullen helped Eliza onto the bench seat with the same careful deliberation, then swung himself up beside her. "Mr. Reyes!" Joseph Hart called from the platform, his voice uncertain now. "Don't you want to, that is, shouldn't we discuss—" "She won't be judged anymore," Cullen said, not turning around. His hands were steady on the reins. "Not by you, not by anyone." He clicked his tongue, and the mules started forward. Eliza sat frozen on the bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Behind them, Red Hollow began to recede. The market square, the platform, her parents, the life she'd known. Ahead of them stretched the road north, dusty and rutted, climbing gradually toward the mountains. They rode in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The sun beat down, relentless. The wagon wheels creaked. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk called. Finally, Eliza found her voice. "Why did you do that?" Cullen didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the road ahead. "Needed help at the ranch." "You paid $150. Her voice came out sharper than she'd intended. "You could have hired 3 ranch hands for that." "Ranch hands don't teach children their letters." Eliza's hands tightened in her lap. I can't." The words stuck in her throat. All the warnings she'd been taught to give, all the ways she was defective and broken and wrong. "Your children are motherless," Cullen said flatly. "Have been for 2 years. They need someone who'll stay, someone who'll care." He glanced at her then, just for a moment, and his expression was unreadable. "You need somewhere to go. Seemed like we could help each other." "I can't give you children," Eliza said, the words coming out in a rush, desperate and ashamed. "I'm Barren. My husband, my former husband, he said—" "Don't care." Eliza blinked. "What?" "I said I don't care." Cullen's voice was level, matter-of-fact. "I have 5 children already. Don't need more. What I need is someone to keep them fed, clean, safe. Someone to teach them that the world doesn't have to be cruel." He paused. "Someone who knows what it's like to be thrown away." The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. She turned her face away toward the scrub brush and red earth stretching endlessly to the horizon, and fought the burning in her eyes. They rode in silence after that, the road climbing higher into the foothills. The air grew slightly cooler, slightly thinner. The landscape changed from flat plains to rolling hills dotted with juniper and piñon pine. In the distance, Eliza could see the darker green of the high country, the place where the ridgeline broke against the sky. "What happened to your wife?" she asked finally, surprising herself with her own boldness. Cullen's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "Fever. Started in her lungs, spread fast. Doctor came out from Sagebend, but by then—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "She died in 3 days. Left me with 5 children under 10 years old and winter coming on." "I'm sorry," Eliza said, and meant it. "That was 2 years ago. We've managed, but—" He shook his head. "Children need more than just managing. Need someone to sing to them, tell them stories, show them how to be gentle in a world that's mostly hard." "And you think I can do that?" "I think," Cullen said slowly, "that you know what it's like to need those things and not have them. That's better than most." The wagon crested a rise, and suddenly the broken ridge spread out before them. It wasn't the most beautiful land Eliza had ever seen. The grass was sparse, golden brown in the late summer heat, and the soil looked rocky and difficult. But there was something about the way the ridgeline cut sharp against the sky, something about the stubborn juniper trees that clung to the slopes, that made her chest tighten. And there, tucked into a hollow, where a thin line of cottonwood suggested water, stood a house. It was small, 1 story, maybe 4 rooms at most, built of rough lumber that had weathered to silver gray. The roof sagged slightly on one side, and one of the shutters hung crooked. But there was a porch across the front, and in the yard, Eliza's breath caught. 5 children stood in the yard, arranged in a line like soldiers awaiting inspection. The oldest was a boy of perhaps 9 or 10, thin and serious-faced. The youngest was a little girl who couldn't have been more than 3, clinging to the skirt of the next oldest, a girl of maybe 5. Between them stood 2 more, another boy and another girl, both somewhere in the middle years of childhood. They all stared at the approaching wagon with identical expressions of wary hope. Cullen pulled the mules to a stop in front of the house and set the brake. For a moment, he just sat there, looking at his children. Then he climbed down and turned to help Eliza. Her legs shook when her feet hit the ground. The 5 pairs of eyes watching her were more intimidating than the entire crowd in Red Hollow had been. "Children," Cullen said, his voice gruff but not unkind, "this is Mrs. Hart. She's going to be staying with us, helping out." He paused, then added, "You'll treat her with respect, same as you would your mother." The oldest boy's face darkened. "She's not our mother." "No," Cullen agreed. "She's not. Your mother's gone, Thomas. But Mrs. Hart is here now, and she's part of this family. Understood?" Thomas's jaw set in a way that reminded Eliza painfully of Cullen, but he nodded once, sharp and resentful. "Good." Cullen looked at the others. "Thomas, this is Margaret, she's 8, Lucas is 6, Lila's 5, and that's Ruth hanging on to her. She's 3. Eliza tried to smile at them, but her face felt stiff, unfamiliar with the expression. "Hello." Only the littlest one, Ruth, smiled back, a gap-toothed grin that showed where her front teeth had fallen out. "Hello. You're pretty. Do you know any stories?" "Ruth, hush," Margaret said sharply, but her eyes were fixed on Eliza with desperate curiosity. Yes, Eliza managed. "I know some stories." "Can you teach letters?" Lucas asked, his voice shy. "Papa says you can teach letters." "I can try." "Can you make good biscuits?" This from Lila, who was still holding Ruth's hand. Mrs. Henderson came sometimes, and her biscuits were always hard. Despite everything, the fear, the strangeness, the overwhelming sense of being dropped into a life she didn't understand, Eliza felt something like a laugh trying to escape her throat. "I can make biscuits. I don't know if they're good, but—" "Better than Mrs. Henderson's, probably," Thomas muttered, and for just a second his expression softened into something that might have been humor. "All right," Cullen said. "Thomas, Lucas, go tend to the mules. Margaret, show Mrs. Hart where things are in the house. Lila, Ruth, you help your sister." He looked at Eliza. "I need to check the fence line before dark. You'll be all right?" It wasn't really a question, Eliza realized, or rather, it was a test. Could she manage? Could she handle 5 children without him there to referee? She straightened her spine. "I'll be fine." Something flickered in Cullen's eyes. Approval, maybe, or just relief. He nodded once, then turned and strode toward the barn without looking back. Margaret watched him go, then turned to Eliza with an expression of careful assessment. "Come on then, I'll show you." The house was as rough inside as it was outside. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room all in one, with a stone fireplace against one wall and a scarred wooden table in the center. 2 doors led off to what Eliza assumed were bedrooms. Everything was clean, surprisingly clean, but bare. No curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floor, no pictures on the walls. It was a house stripped of softness, of beauty, of anything that wasn't strictly necessary for survival. "That's where we eat," Margaret said, pointing to the table. "Papa says you have to sit up straight and not waste food. That's the stove. It's temperamental. Lucas is supposed to keep the wood box full, but he forgets sometimes. That's where we keep the dishes. We each have our own plate and cup, and you have to wash them after you use them." She spoke in a rush, as if afraid she'd forget something important, and Eliza realized the child was nervous, trying to be helpful, trying to show she knew things, knew how to take care of the house, knew how to be useful. "You've done a good job," Eliza said softly. "Keeping everything so clean." Margaret's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Mama always said a clean house means a clear mind. I try to remember what she taught me, but Her voice wavered. Sometimes I forget. And Thomas says I'm too bossy, but someone has to... You're not too bossy, Eliza interrupted gently. You're responsible. That's different. Margaret's eyes widened, and for a moment she looked much younger than 8. Really? Really? Mrs. Hart? Lila's voice came from the doorway. She was still holding Ruth's hand, and both girls looked uncertain. Are you going to sleep in Papa's room? The question caught Eliza off guard. I don't, because Mama used to sleep there, Lila continued, her voice very small. But then she died, and Papa sleeps there alone now. And Thomas and Lucas sleep in the other room, and me and Margaret and Ruth all sleep together, so I was just wondering. I'll sleep wherever your Papa says, Eliza said carefully. But I imagine I'll sleep in the room with you girls, if that's all right. Really? Lila's face brightened. You'd sleep with us? If you'll have me. Can you tell us stories before bed? Ruth piped up, bouncing on her toes. Mama used to tell stories. She knew lots of stories about princesses and magic beans and... Ruth, don't bother Mrs. Hart, Margaret said, but her voice lacked real force. She's not bothering me, Eliza said. And then before she could stop herself, I'd like to tell you stories, if you want. The 3 girls looked at each other, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then Lila nodded, solemn and decisive. We want. Something in Eliza's chest, something that had been clenched tight for so long she'd forgotten it was there, began to loosen. All right, she said. But first, let's see about making some supper. Your Papa will be hungry when he comes in, and so will your brothers. They worked together in the kitchen as the afternoon light shifted toward evening, Eliza trying to navigate the temperamental stove while Margaret directed her to where things were kept. Lila and Ruth peeling potatoes with more enthusiasm than skill. The boys came in from tending the mules, and Thomas showed her where the bacon was kept, where the eggs were, in a basket by the back door, where the sourdough starter lived in its earthenware crock. It was simple food: bacon, eggs, potatoes fried in the bacon grease, thick slices of bread that Margaret had apparently baked that morning. But when Cullen came in from the fence line, dusty and tired, and sat down at the table with his children, and they all bowed their heads while he said a brief grace, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in years. She felt like she might belong somewhere. The meal was quiet. The children ate steadily, efficiently, clearly hungry. Cullen ate without speaking, his attention on his plate. But when Eliza refilled his coffee, carefully, trying not to spill, he looked up at her and nodded once. Thank you. 2 words, that was all. But they settled in Eliza's chest like a warm stone. After supper, the children helped clear the table without being asked. Margaret showed Eliza where the dish basin was, how they heated water for washing. Thomas and Lucas carried the dirty plates to the basin, and even little Ruth tried to help, though she mostly just got in the way. When the dishes were done and put away, Cullen stood from his chair by the fire. Bedtime, he said simply. The children moved without arguing, not happily exactly, but without the resistance Eliza had seen in other families. They were tired, she realized, tired in a deep-down way that had nothing to do with the day's work and everything to do with carrying worry too heavy for their years. Can Mrs. Hart tell us a story? Ruth asked, her voice already drowsy. Cullen looked at Eliza, one eyebrow raised in question. Yes, Eliza said. If that's all right. Up to you. He turned to Thomas and Lucas. You two, bed, now. The boys disappeared into one of the bedrooms. Cullen lingered for a moment, then nodded to Eliza and headed outside, probably for one last check of the animals before full dark. Eliza followed the 3 girls into the other bedroom. It was small, just big enough for one narrow bed that all 3 clearly shared. Their nightgowns hung on pegs on the wall, and a single thin blanket lay folded at the foot of the bed. The girls changed quickly, unselfconsciously, then climbed into bed together, Ruth in the middle, Margaret and Lila on either side. They looked up at Eliza expectantly. She sat on the edge of the bed, the old ropes creaking under her weight, and tried to remember the stories her grandmother had told her, back before everything went wrong. Before Samuel. Before the accusations and the failure and the shame. Once upon a time, she began, her voice rusty with disuse, There was a garden that grew in a place where nothing should grow. She didn't know where the story came from. Maybe her grandmother, maybe something she'd read once, maybe something she was making up as she went along. But the girls listened, their eyes wide in the lamplight, and when Ruth's breathing deepened into sleep, Eliza kept talking, softer now, until Lila's eyes drifted closed too. Only Margaret stayed awake, watching Eliza with an expression too old for her years. "Will you stay?" Margaret whispered finally. Eliza's throat tightened. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know if your papa will want me to once he—" "He paid a lot of money for you," Margaret said, matter of fact. "More than Mrs. Henderson ever asked for. He wouldn't do that if he didn't want you to stay. People don't always keep the things they pay for." "Papa does." Margaret's voice was absolutely certain. "Papa never wastes anything, never throws anything away if it might be useful. And you're useful. You made good supper. You didn't yell when Ruth spilled water on the floor. You told us a story." She paused, then added very quietly, "I think you might stay." Eliza wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that this place, this family, might become something more than just another chapter in her long story of rejection and disappointment. But she'd learned the hard way not to trust hope. "We'll see," she said softly. "Now sleep. Tomorrow will come early." Margaret nodded and closed her eyes, and Eliza sat there a moment longer, watching the three girls breathe, watching the way they curled together for warmth and comfort. Ruth's hand was tangled in Lila's nightgown. Lila's head rested on Margaret's shoulder. They were their own small unit, their own defense against the world. And they were letting her into it. Eliza rose carefully and tiptoed out of the room, pulling the door closed behind her. The main room was lit only by the dying fire in the hearth. Cullen sat in a chair by the fireplace, his hands hanging loose between his knees, his head bowed. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "They asleep?" he asked finally. "Yes." "Good." He stood, unfolding his long frame with the careful movements of a man who'd worked his body hard for too many years. "I'll show you where things are. Blankets, spare clothes if you need them. Tomorrow we'll—" "Why did you really buy me?" Eliza interrupted. Cullen stopped, looked at her. In the firelight, his face was all shadows and angles, impossible to read. "Told you, needed help. You could have hired help, you could have— You want the truth?" His voice was rough, almost angry. "Fine, I'll give you the truth. I watched your father sell you like an animal in that square, and I watched you stand there and take it, because you had no choice. I watched those people laugh at you, mock you for something that wasn't your fault. And I thought—" He stopped, his jaw working. "I thought about my Maria, my wife, how she'd have looked at those people, what she'd have said." "What would she have said?" "She'd have said that any woman brave enough to stand in that square and hold her head up while the world tore her apart was worth more than all of them put together." His eyes met Eliza's, hard and certain. "She'd have said that woman deserved a chance, deserved a place where she wouldn't be judged for things she couldn't control. And Maria would have wanted me to give you that chance, so I did." Eliza stood very still, afraid that if she moved, if she spoke, something precious and fragile would shatter. Finally, she managed, "Thank you." Cullen shook his head. "Don't thank me yet. This place is hard. The work is never ending. The children, they're good children, but they're hurting, and hurt children don't always show their best selves. You might decide in a week that you want to leave. If you do—" He paused. "If you do, I'll take you wherever you want to go, no questions, no judgment. And if I don't want to leave?" Something flickered in his expression. Hope, maybe, or just exhaustion. "Then you stay, simple as that." But nothing, Eliza thought, as she watched him disappear into his empty bedroom, was ever that simple. She made herself a bed on the floor by the fire, using spare blankets Cullen had left out for her. The floor was hard, the blankets thin, but she'd slept in worse places. At least here, she was warm. At least here, no one was telling her she was worthless, broken, wrong. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. The creak of wood, the whisper of wind under the eaves, the distant call of a coyote on the ridge. In the bedroom next to her, she could hear the soft breathing of the three girls. In the other direction, the occasional shift and rustle from the boys' room. And beyond that, silence from Cullen's room. Heavy, absolute silence. Tomorrow, she thought, would come soon enough. Tomorrow she'd have to figure out how to work the temperamental stove, how to keep 5 children fed and clothed and safe, how to navigate this strange new life she'd been dropped into. Tomorrow, she'd have to decide if she was brave enough to stay or wise enough to leave. But tonight, lying on the hard floor in a house full of strangers, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely worthless after all. And that was enough to let her finally sleep. The rooster's crow dragged Eliza from sleep before dawn had fully broken. For a moment she lay disoriented on the hard floor, her body stiff from the unforgiving boards beneath the thin blankets. Then memory flooded back. The auction, the wagon ride, the 5 pairs of eyes watching her, the house that wasn't hers but might become so. She pushed herself upright, wincing at the protest in her shoulders and back. Through the window she could see the sky beginning to pale, that deep blue-gray that came just before sunrise. From somewhere outside came the sound of footsteps, steady and purposeful. Cullen, already up and working. Eliza folded the blankets quickly and moved to the stove, trying to remember everything Margaret had told her yesterday. The kindling box was beside it, the matches on the shelf above. She'd built fires before, countless fires in countless kitchens, but this stove had its own temperament, its own demands. It took 3 tries before the fire caught properly, and by then she could hear stirring from the children's rooms. She found the coffee pot, measured grounds the way she'd seen Cullen do the night before, and set water to boil. Then she turned her attention to breakfast. The bacon was easy enough. She sliced it thick and laid it in the cast-iron skillet, listening to it sizzle and pop as the fat rendered. But when she went to crack eggs into the grease, her hands shook. Stupid, trembling hands that had learned to expect punishment for the smallest mistake. The first egg broke clean. The second one she fumbled, and shell fragments fell into the pan along with the yolk. "Damn," she whispered, then froze. She'd cursed. In a house full of children, what kind of... My papa says worse than that when he hits his thumb with the hammer. Eliza spun around. Thomas stood in the doorway of the boys' room, already dressed in worn trousers and a shirt that was slightly too small for him. His dark hair stuck up in all directions, and his eyes, so much like his father's, watched her with careful assessment. I'm sorry," Eliza stammered. "I shouldn't have... Don't matter to me." Thomas moved past her to the wash basin, splashing water on his face with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. "You get the shell out?" "What?" "The eggshell in the pan. You get it out, or are we eating crunchy eggs this morning?" There was no mockery in his voice, just curiosity. Eliza turned back to the stove and carefully fished out the shell fragments with a fork. "Got it. Good. Papa hates shell in his eggs." Thomas dried his face on a threadbare towel. "You want me to wake the others?" Yes, thank you." He nodded and disappeared into the girl's room. A moment later, Eliza heard his voice, gruff but not unkind. "Up. Mrs. Hart's making breakfast and you don't want it to get cold." The house came alive then with the sounds of children waking, rustling clothes, whispered arguments, Ruth's sleepy complaints about wanting 5 more minutes. Eliza focused on the stove, turning the bacon, watching the eggs cook through, trying to remember where Margaret had said the plates were kept. "Here." Margaret appeared at her elbow, already dressed, her hair braided with the kind of precision that suggested she'd been doing it herself for a long time. She pulled down 6 plates from the shelf and set them on the table with practiced efficiency. "Papa likes his coffee black. Thomas takes his with lots of milk if we have it. The little ones get milk, not coffee. Papa's strict about that." "All right." Eliza's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Thank you." Margaret hesitated, then lowered her voice. "You're doing fine. Better than Mrs. Henderson. She burned everything." The back door opened, bringing with it a gust of cool morning air, and Cullen, who'd clearly been out checking the animals. He stopped when he saw Eliza at the stove, something flickering across his face too quick to name. Then he moved to the wash basin, cleaned his hands, and took his seat at the head of the table without a word. The children arranged themselves in what was clearly their established order, Thomas to Cullen's right, Margaret to his left, then the younger ones filling in the spaces between. They waited, hands folded, until Cullen bowed his head. Lord, we thank you for this food and for the hands that prepared it. Watch over us this day. Amen. Amen, the children echoed. Eliza served the food, her hands steadier now, and took the empty seat at the far end of the table. The bacon was perhaps a bit too crispy, and one of the eggs had broken in the pan, but no one complained. They ate with the single-minded focus of people who never knew when the next meal might come, and Eliza found herself watching them, the way Thomas cut Ruth's bacon into small pieces without being asked, the way Margaret made sure Lila got enough, the way Lucas ate with his eyes down, as if afraid to draw attention to himself. Mrs. Hart, Cullen's voice made her jump. After breakfast, Margaret will show you where things are. The garden, the smokehouse, the root cellar. Children have their chores to do. You get yourself settled today. Tomorrow we'll work out a proper routine. Yes, sir. His jaw tightened slightly. Cullen. My name is Cullen. Yes, sir. Cullen. The name felt strange in her mouth, too familiar, too intimate for a man she'd known less than a day. He nodded once and returned to his breakfast. The meal finished in silence, and then the children scattered to their morning tasks. Thomas and Lucas to the barn, Margaret to gathering eggs, Lila and Ruth to making beds and sweeping floors. Cullen disappeared outside with a toolbox, heading toward the sagging section of roof. Eliza stood in the kitchen, surrounded by dirty dishes, and felt the weight of everything she didn't know pressing down on her shoulders. But she'd survived worse than not knowing things. She'd survived Samuel's cold dismissal, her parents' cruelty, 3 years of being told she was less than worthless. She could survive learning how to run an unfamiliar house. She heated water, washed the dishes, put them away where Margaret had shown her. Then she tied on her bonnet, her only one, battered and sun-faded, and stepped outside. The morning sun was fully up now, painting the ridgeline gold and casting long shadows across the yard. The house sat in its hollow, like something that had grown there naturally, part of the landscape rather than imposed upon it. Beyond the barn, Eliza could see fence lines stretching toward the horizon, and cattle moving slowly across the sparse grass. Mrs. Hart? Margaret appeared from around the side of the house, a basket of eggs balanced on her hip. Ready? For the next hour, Margaret led Eliza on a tour of the property, the smokehouse where they kept the bacon and any game Cullen managed to shoot, the root cellar dug into the hillside where potatoes and turnips and precious onions stayed cool through the summer, the chicken coop where a dozen hens scratched and muttered to themselves. There was a garden patch behind the house, but it looked discouraged, the soil hard-packed and reluctant. Mama used to grow tomatoes, Margaret said quietly, standing at the edge of the garden. And beans, and squash. But after she died, Papa didn't have time, and I didn't know how, and Thomas said it was foolish to waste water on vegetables when we needed it for the cattle. Your mother liked gardening? She loved it. Margaret's voice went soft with memory. She said growing things was like prayer. You put something small in the earth and trusted God to make it bigger. She looked up at Eliza. Do you know anything about gardens? Eliza thought of her grandmother's garden, back when she was small, neat rows of lettuce and carrots, tomatoes growing fat on their vines, the smell of basil and mint in the hot sun. She'd helped sometimes, before her grandmother died, before everything changed. A little, she said. Maybe we could try. If your father agrees. Margaret's face brightened. Really? You'd want to? I'd like to try. And it was true, Eliza realized. The idea of putting her hands in soil, of growing something, made something in her chest loosen. They walked back toward the house, Margaret chattering now about what her mother had planted and when, what had grown well and what had struggled. As they rounded the corner of the barn, raised voices stopped them both. Told you to mind the fence line, not waste time on foolishness. Cullen's voice, sharper than Eliza had heard it, carrying from inside the barn. She and Margaret exchanged glances, and Margaret's face went tight with worry. It's not foolishness. The calf was stuck, and I had to... Thomas, defensive and angry. You had to follow orders. When I tell you to check the fence line, you check the fence line. We lose cattle through broken fence, and we lose money we can't afford to lose. I was trying to help. By disobeying, That's not help, Thomas. That's... Eliza found herself moving before she'd consciously decided to, stepping into the barn's dimness with Margaret trailing uncertain behind her. Cullen and Thomas stood facing each other in the center aisle, Cullen with his arms crossed, Thomas with his fists clenched, both of them radiating fury and hurt in equal measure. "I'm sorry," Eliza said quickly. "I didn't mean to interrupt, but this doesn't concern you." Thomas's voice cracked on the words, hovering somewhere between boy and man. "Thomas," Cullen's voice held warning. "It's true. She's been here one day and now she thinks she can..." "Enough." Cullen's voice dropped to something low and dangerous. "You don't speak to Mrs. Hart that way." "Understood?" Thomas's face went red, then white. For a moment Eliza thought he might cry, or rage, or both. Instead he turned and stalked past her, his shoulder deliberately clipping hers as he went, and disappeared out into the bright morning. Silence fell in the barn, broken only by the shuffling of horses in their stalls and the distant clucking of chickens. "I'm sorry." Cullen's voice was tired now, the anger drained out of it. He's a good boy, but he's angry. Angry at the world for taking his mother, angry at me for not being able to fix it. "He's protecting you," Eliza said quietly. Cullen looked at her sharply. "What?" "He's angry at me because I'm a stranger in his mother's house, because he thinks I'm trying to replace her. He's protecting her memory, and he's protecting you from being hurt again." Eliza wrapped her arms around herself. "My husband, my former husband, he had a sister who acted the same way. After the marriage was annulled, she told me she'd hated me because she was afraid I'd take her brother away from her. Thomas is afraid I'll take you away from him." Cullen was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. Finally, he said, "You're probably right. Doesn't excuse his rudeness." "No," Eliza agreed, "but it explains it." "Mrs. Hart?" Margaret's small voice came from the doorway. "Should I go find Thomas?" "No." Cullen straightened, his shoulders settling back into their usual square position. "Let him cool off. He'll come back when he's ready." He looked at Eliza. "You settling in all right?" "Yes. Margaret's been very helpful." "Good. I've got fence to mend. If you need anything, we'll manage," Eliza said with more confidence than she felt. He nodded and strode past them, his boots striking the packed earth with purpose. Margaret watched him go, her face troubled. "Thomas doesn't mean it," she said quietly. "About you being here. He's just... I know." Eliza put a hand on the girl's thin shoulder. "Come on, let's see about getting some lunch ready. Your father and brothers will be hungry, and maybe food will help." They spent the rest of the morning in the kitchen, and Eliza began to understand the rhythm of the house, the constant need for food, the endless cycle of cooking and cleaning and preparing the next meal. Margaret worked beside her with quiet competence, showing her where things were kept, warning her about the stove's hot spots, sharing the small domestic knowledge she'd accumulated in her 8 years. Lucas came in around noon, shy and dusty, followed by Lila and Ruth, who'd been playing some complicated game involving sticks and imagination. Thomas came in last, his face closed and stubborn, and took his seat without meeting anyone's eyes. Lunch was beans and cornbread, simple and filling. The children ate steadily. Cullen came in halfway through, grabbed a plate, and disappeared back outside almost immediately. Eliza noticed Thomas watching his father go with an expression of mingled resentment and longing, and her heart ached for him. After lunch, Margaret helped her clean up while the younger children were supposed to be napping. Supposed to be. Eliza could hear them whispering and giggling in their room, Ruth's voice rising occasionally before being shushed by Lila. Normal sounds, happy sounds. "Mrs. Hart?" Margaret's voice was hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Are you going to marry Papa?" Eliza's hand stilled in the dishwater. No, I don't think... Your father bought me to help with the house, not to..." "But you could," Margaret pressed. "If he asked, you could say yes." "Margaret, I'm not trying to replace Mama," Margaret said quickly. "I know no one could replace Mama, but Papa, he's so lonely, and we need..." Her voice broke slightly. "We need someone who'll stay. Everyone else leaves. Mrs. Henderson left. Mrs. Crawford from church said she'd help, but then her husband got work in Colorado and they moved. Everyone leaves." Eliza dried her hands slowly on the towel, choosing her words carefully. I can't promise I'll stay forever, Margaret. I don't know what your father wants, what he expects from me, but I can promise that I won't leave without talking to you first, without making sure you're all taken care of. All right? It wasn't the promise Margaret wanted. Eliza could see that in the disappointment that flickered across the girl's face. But she nodded anyway and went back to drying dishes with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. The afternoon stretched long and hot. Eliza tackled the mending pile Margaret showed her, shirts with torn seams, trousers with holes in the knees, socks that were more darn than original fabric. Her hands remembered the rhythm of needle and thread, the careful small stitches her grandmother had taught her. It was meditative work, soothing, and she found herself relaxing into it. Around 4, Ruth appeared at her elbow, having given up on the nap entirely. Mrs. Hart, will you teach me my letters now? Ruth, don't bother her, Margaret called from where she was sweeping the floor. She's not bothering me. Eliza set aside the mending. Do you have something to write with? Ruth produced a slate and a piece of chalk with the air of someone presenting treasure. Mama taught Margaret and Thomas, but then she got sick, and Thomas knows all his letters, but I only know some of them. They sat together at the table, and Eliza wrote out the alphabet in careful capitals. Ruth traced each letter with her finger, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Soon Lila joined them, then Lucas. All 3 of them crowded around the slate, eager and curious. That was how Cullen found them when he came in for supper, Eliza at the table with 3 children pressed close, teaching them to form the letter M, patiently correcting Lucas's backwards N. He stopped in the doorway, and something crossed his face that Eliza couldn't read. Then he cleared his throat. Time to wash up for supper. The children scattered like startled birds. Eliza stood, suddenly self-conscious. I should start cooking. Already smells like something's cooking. Eliza followed his gaze to the stove, where a pot she'd set on hours ago was bubbling gently. Stew, made from salt pork and potatoes, and the last sad carrots from the root cellar. It wasn't much, but it was hot, and it was ready. Margaret helped, she said quickly. I'm sure she did. Cullen moved to the wash basin. You're good with them, the children. It wasn't quite a compliment, more an observation, but it warmed Eliza anyway. They're good children. They are. He dried his hands, his movements deliberate. Thomas apologized to you yet? No. He will. I'll see to it. You don't have to. Yes, Cullen said quietly. I do. He was disrespectful. That's not how I'm raising him to be. The children trooped back in, faces damp from washing, and took their seats. Thomas sat stiff and silent at his place, his eyes fixed on the table. Cullen said grace, and they ate. The stew was better than Eliza had expected. The salt pork rendered enough fat to make it rich, the potatoes soft and filling. Even Thomas ate 2 bowls, though he still wouldn't look at her. Ruth chattered about the letters she'd learned. Lila talked about the game she and Ruth had invented, and Lucas asked if tomorrow they could practice writing his name. After supper, as Eliza and Margaret cleared the dishes, Thomas finally stood from his chair. He crossed to where Eliza stood at the wash basin and stopped, his hands jammed in his pockets, his face red with effort. I'm sorry, he said to the floor, for what I said. In the barn. It wasn't respectful. Eliza's hands stilled in the water. She could feel Cullen watching from his chair by the fire, could feel Margaret holding her breath, waiting. Apology accepted, she said quietly. Thomas nodded once, sharp and relieved, and fled to the boys' room. Cullen met Eliza's eyes across the room and gave her a single nod of approval. It shouldn't have mattered so much, that nod, but somehow it did. That night, the girls begged for another story, and Eliza found herself making up tales about brave gardens and stubborn seeds that grew in impossible places. Ruth fell asleep first, then Lila, and finally Margaret, though she fought it, her eyes drifting closed and snapping open again and again until sleep finally claimed her. Eliza sat on the edge of their bed for a long time after they slept, watching them breathe, watching the way they held on to each other even in dreams. These children who'd lost so much, these children who were trying so hard to be strong. When she finally emerged into the main room, Cullen was still up, sitting by the dying fire with a piece of leather in his hands, working an awl through it with patient repetition. He looked up when she entered. "They asleep?" "Yes." "Good." He went back to his work, and Eliza stood uncertainly, not sure if she should retreat to her makeshift bed or— "Sit," Cullen said without looking up. "Unless you're tired." Eliza sat in the other chair, her hands folded in her lap. For a while they existed in companionable silence, the only sounds the crackle of fire and the rhythmic punch of the awl through leather. "What are you making?" she asked finally. "New reins. Old ones are about worn through." He held up the leather to show her. It was careful work, each hole precisely placed. Used to be Maria did this kind of thing. Her hands were steadier than mine. It was the first time he'd voluntarily mentioned his wife. Eliza sat very still, afraid that if she spoke, he'd stop. "She was good at everything," Cullen continued, his voice distant with memory. "Cooking, sewing, managing the children, managing me. This place, it ran smooth as clockwork when she was alive. Now, it's all I can do to keep us fed and the roof from falling in." "You're doing well," Eliza said softly. "The children are healthy, the house is clean, the animals are cared for." "The house is clean because Margaret works herself half to death trying to remember everything her mother taught her. The children are healthy because they're tough, not because I'm doing anything right. And the animals—" He shook his head. "Half the time I feel like I'm drowning, and all I can do is keep my head above water one more day." "That's still something, keeping your head above water. Not everyone can do that." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Eliza felt the weight of his attention like a physical thing. "You've had to do it too. Keep your head up." It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. "For 3 years, after Samuel annulled the marriage. My parents took me back, but they never let me forget why I was there. Every day I had to prove I was worth the food I ate, the space I took up. And every day I failed, because nothing I did could change the fact that I was barren, and that made me worthless in their eyes." "You're not worthless." The words were flat, absolute, and they hit Eliza like a blow. Her throat tightened. "How can you know that? You've known me 2 days." "I know," Cullen said, setting aside his leatherwork, "that you make my children feel safe. I know that you don't yell when things go wrong. I know that you're teaching Ruth her letters, and you didn't flinch when Thomas was rude to you. I know that you're trying, even though this place is probably not what you imagined when you—" He stopped, laughed bitterly. "When you were sold like a piece of property—" "I didn't imagine anything," Eliza admitted. "I just prayed for it to be over. Whatever happened next, I just wanted the shame to end." "Well," Cullen picked up his work again, "shame ends here. You're not barren. You're just not bearing children. That's different. And even if you never had a child, that wouldn't make you worthless. My Maria couldn't read, not a word. She signed her name with an X. But she was the smartest person I ever knew, and the kindest." His hand stilled on the leather. "You remind me of her, not in looks, not in manner, but in the way you don't give up, even when the world's telling you to." Eliza couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She sat there, her hands clenched in her lap, and felt something inside her chest crack open, some hard, frozen place that hadn't thawed in 3 years. "Thank you," she whispered finally. Cullen just nodded and went back to punching holes in leather, and Eliza sat with him until the fire burned down to embers and sleep finally pulled her under. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Wake before dawn, start the fire, make breakfast, clean up, prepare lunch, teach letters, mend clothes, make supper, tell stories, sleep. Over and over, each day bleeding into the next, and Eliza found herself settling into it like a hand into a worn glove. She learned the stove's temperament, learned which burner ran hot and which ran cool. She learned that Thomas liked his bacon crispy and Margaret preferred hers chewy, that Lucas would eat anything put in front of him without complaint, and that Ruth had to be coaxed to eat vegetables but would do anything for a piece of cornbread with honey. She learned that Lila was quiet but observant, that she saw everything and forgot nothing. She learned that Cullen took his coffee black and strong, that he ate quickly and efficiently, that he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders and never complained about it. And slowly, carefully, she began to feel like maybe she belonged there. It was a week after she'd arrived that everything changed. The evening started normally enough, supper eaten, dishes washed, children getting ready for bed. But as Eliza tucked the girls in and started their bedtime story, she noticed Lila's cheeks were flushed, her eyes too bright. "Sweetheart?" Eliza pressed her hand to Lila's forehead and felt her heart drop. The child was burning up. "Margaret, get your father, now." Cullen came quickly, took one look at Lila, and his face went gray. "No," he said hoarsely. "Not again, not—" "Get cold water," Eliza ordered, her voice sharper than she'd ever used with him. "And clean cloths. Margaret, get me the willow bark from the shelf. You know which one?" Margaret nodded, her face white with fear, and ran. The night that followed was the longest of Eliza's life. She bathed Lila in cool water, forced willow bark tea between the child's cracked lips, sang every song she'd ever known, and some she made up on the spot. Cullen sat rigid in the corner, his hands clenched on his knees, watching with the expression of a man watching his whole world about to end. "Talk to her," Eliza said at one point, when Lila's fever climbed higher and the child began to thrash and cry out. "Tell her you're here. Tell her she's safe." Cullen moved to the bed like a man in a dream. He took Lila's small hand in his large one and began to speak in Spanish, soft, rhythmic words that Eliza didn't understand but that seemed to calm the child. His voice cracked and broke, but he kept talking, kept holding Lila's hand, kept anchoring her to the world. Dawn came gray and cold. Lila's fever broke suddenly, sweat soaking through her nightgown, her breathing evening out into something that sounded like real sleep instead of the restless tossing of illness. Eliza slumped back in her chair, every muscle in her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Cullen pressed his forehead against Lila's hand, his shoulders shaking with what might have been sobs or prayers, or both. "She's all right," Eliza whispered. "She's going to be all right." Cullen looked up at her, and the gratitude in his eyes was almost painful to witness. "You saved her." "We saved her, together." He stood slowly, crossed to where Eliza sat, and did something that shocked her into stillness. He took both her hands in his and squeezed them gently. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "Thank you for not giving up, for knowing what to do, for being here." His hands were warm and rough and solid, and Eliza felt something shift inside her, something fundamental and irreversible. This man, this house, these children, they weren't just temporary shelter anymore. They were becoming something else, something that felt dangerously like home. "I'm glad I was here," she said softly, and meant it with everything in her. Cullen's hands released hers slowly, as if he was reluctant to break the contact, and Eliza found herself equally reluctant to pull away. The moment stretched between them, waited with something neither seemed ready to name, until Lila stirred in her sleep and made a small sound of distress. "I should stay with her," Eliza said, the spell breaking, "in case the fever comes back." "I'll stay too." Cullen settled back into the chair he'd occupied all night, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. "You should rest. You've been up all night. So have you. I'm used to it." His voice was rough with exhaustion and something else, something that might have been the echo of other nights, other vigils, another woman who hadn't survived the fever. "Please, I need to know you're rested, in case—" He didn't finish, but Eliza understood. In case this happened again. In case another child fell ill. In case the world tried to take something else from him, and he needed her strong enough to fight it. "Wake me if anything changes," she said quietly, and left him there in the gray dawn light, watching over his daughter with the fierce protectiveness of a man who'd already lost too much. She slept fitfully for a few hours on her makeshift bed by the fire, and woke to find Margaret standing over her, her face pinched with worry. "Is Lila—" "She's fine. Still sleeping, but the fever's gone." Eliza pushed herself upright. "Your father's with her." Relief flooded Margaret's face, followed immediately by something that looked like guilt. "I should have noticed she was getting sick. Should have told Papa sooner. Should have—" "Margaret." Eliza caught the girl's hand, stopping the spiral of self-recrimination. "You can't see everything. You can't prevent everything. Sometimes people get sick and it's nobody's fault. But Mama got sick and we didn't notice until it was too late, and Papa says if we'd caught it sooner, if we'd—" Your papa was scared and hurting and looking for someone to blame, Eliza said gently. But it wasn't your fault then, and this isn't your fault now. Do you understand me? Margaret's eyes filled with tears she'd probably been holding back for 2 years. I try so hard, she whispered. I try to be good, to remember everything Mama taught me, to take care of everyone, but I'm only 8, and sometimes I forget things and I'm so tired. Oh, sweetheart. Eliza pulled the girl into her arms, felt the thin shoulders shake with sobs that had been locked away too long. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to remember everything. You just have to be 8 years old and let the adults worry about the rest. But Papa needs help, and Thomas is always angry, and the little ones need so much, and now I'm here. Eliza held Margaret tighter. And you don't have to carry it all alone anymore, all right? You can just be Margaret. Just be a little girl who likes to keep things neat and wants to grow tomatoes like her mama did. You don't have to be the mama yourself. Margaret cried harder, her face pressed against Eliza's shoulder, and Eliza held her and rocked her and wished desperately that she could take away all the hurt this child had been carrying. Eventually the sobs quieted to hiccups, and Margaret pulled back, wiping her face with her sleeve. Don't tell Papa I cried. Why not? Because he has enough to worry about. He doesn't need to know I'm... Margaret stopped, searching for words. That I'm not strong enough. Crying doesn't mean you're not strong, Eliza said firmly. It means you're human. And your father, Margaret, your father would want to know if you're hurting. He loves you. I know. Margaret's voice was small. But loving me makes him worry, and he worries enough already. Eliza's heart broke a little more. This child who was trying so hard to be small, to not be a burden, to not take up space in her own father's heart. We'll work on that, she said, together. But right now, let's see about getting some breakfast made. The others will be hungry, and your father probably hasn't eaten since yesterday. They worked together in the kitchen, the familiar routine steadying them both. Thomas and Lucas emerged from their room, both subdued and worried about their sister. Ruth appeared last, rubbing her eyes and asking in a sleepy voice if Lila was going to die like Mama did. No, Eliza said firmly, before anyone else could speak. Lila is going to be fine. She had a fever, and now it's gone, and she'll probably sleep most of today while her body gets strong again, but she's not going to die. Promise? Ruth's lower lip trembled. Eliza crouched down to the little girl's level, meeting her eyes directly. I promise. And when she wakes up, maybe you can draw her a picture to make her feel better. Would you like that? Ruth nodded, mollified, and went to find the precious piece of paper and pencil stub they kept for special occasions. They ate breakfast quietly, all of them glancing toward the closed door of the girls' room where Cullen still sat vigil. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, Eliza fixed a plate and carried it in. Cullen looked up when she entered, his face gray with exhaustion but peaceful. Lila slept on, her breathing even and natural, her face no longer flushed with fever. Thank you, he said, taking the plate. But I'm not... You're going to eat, Eliza interrupted gently. Because if you collapse from not taking care of yourself, who's going to take care of everyone else? A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You're bossy when you're worried. I'm practical when people are being foolish. She sat on the edge of Ruth's side of the bed. Eat. I'll sit with her. He ate slowly, mechanically, his eyes never leaving Lila for long. When he finished, he set the plate aside and rubbed his face with both hands. I thought I was going to lose her. When I saw that fever, all I could think about was Maria, how fast it took her, how helpless I was. But you weren't helpless this time. You got help. You stayed with her. You fought for her. You fought for her, Cullen corrected. I just sat here and tried not to fall apart. You were exactly where she needed you to be. Eliza's voice was gentle but firm. She could hear you, Cullen. When you were speaking Spanish to her, she calmed down. She knew you were there, and that helped her hold on. He was quiet for a long moment, his rough hands clasped between his knees. Then, Maria used to sing to them when they were sick, Spanish lullabies her grandmother taught her. I can't sing worth a damn, so I talk, Tell them stories about when Maria and I were young, before all this weight landed on our shoulders. Tell them about the first time I saw their mother, how she was hanging laundry, and the wind caught her hair, and I thought she was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. That's a good story, Eliza said softly. They should know those stories. They should know who their mother was when she was young and happy. I don't want them to forget her. The words came out raw, almost angry. Everyone says time heals, that eventually the hurt gets smaller, but I don't want it to get smaller. I don't want them to wake up one day and realize they can't quite remember her voice anymore. They won't forget, Eliza promised. Not as long as you keep telling the stories. Not as long as you keep her alive in the way you raise them, in the values you teach them. She's in every good thing they do, every kind word they speak. That's how she stays alive. Cullen looked at her then with an expression that made Eliza's breath catch. You're a wise woman, Eliza Hart. It was the first time he'd used her first name, and it sent something warm and dangerous through her chest. I'm just a woman who's had a lot of time to think about loss. Still, he stood, picked up the empty plate. I should get to work. The cattle don't care that I was up all night, and that fence line still needs mending. Cullen, you need to sleep. I'll sleep tonight. Right now I need to do something useful, something I can fix. He looked down at Lila one more time, something fierce and protective crossing his face. Stay with her? Of course. He left, and Eliza settled into the chair he'd vacated, still warm from his body. She watched Lila sleep and thought about the way Cullen had held her hands earlier, the desperation and gratitude in his grip. Thought about the way her name had sounded in his rough voice. Thought about how dangerous it was, this feeling growing in her chest, tender and terrifying and completely inappropriate for a woman who'd been bought like livestock not even 2 weeks ago. Lila slept through most of the day, waking only briefly to sip water and ask in a confused voice where she was. Eliza told her she was safe, she'd been sick but was getting better, and Lila seemed satisfied with that answer. The other children came in and out, bringing drawings and whispered messages and worried looks. Thomas brought a smooth river stone he'd found, laying it on the table beside the bed like an offering. By evening, Lila was awake enough to eat a little broth and complain that her throat hurt. Eliza considered this a good sign. Complaining meant healing. Cullen came in for supper, his clothes dusty, and his face showing the strain of a full day's work on no sleep, but there was something lighter in his expression when he saw Lila sitting up against the pillows. Hey there, little bird, he said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. Gave us quite a scare. I'm sorry, Papa. Lila's voice was hoarse. I didn't mean to get sick. I know you didn't. Not your fault. He brushed her hair back from her forehead with a gentleness that made Eliza's throat tight. You just rest now. Get strong again. Will Mrs. Hart tell us a story tonight? Cullen glanced at Eliza, one eyebrow raised in question. If you'd like, Eliza said, though maybe a short one tonight so you can sleep. Can it be about gardens? Lila asked. I like the ones about gardens. So that night, with Lila propped on pillows and Ruth and Margaret curled on either side of her, Eliza told a story about a garden that grew in impossible soil, fed by stubbornness and hope. And when the children finally slept, exhausted from the drama of the day, she emerged to find Cullen still up, sitting by the fire again, this time with idle hands. You should sleep, she said. I will. In a bit. He gestured to the other chair. Sit with me. She sat, and they existed together in the firelight, not speaking, but not needing to. The silence between them had changed over the past weeks, become comfortable, companionable, a shared language of two people learning to exist in the same space. Eliza. His voice was quiet, careful. What you did today, I need you to know how much it meant, how much you mean to all of us. Her heart stuttered in her chest. I just did what anyone would. No. He cut her off gently but firmly. Not anyone. Most people would have panicked, would have run for the doctor and wasted time we didn't have. You knew what to do, and you did it, and you saved my daughter's life. He paused, then added softly, You're part of this family now, whether you planned on it or not. Eliza didn't know what to say to that. The enormity of it, the acceptance, the belonging, the terrifying possibility that this might actually last, overwhelmed her. "I'm glad I was here," she finally managed. "I'm glad I could help." "Stay," Cullen said, and the single word carried the weight of everything unsaid. "Not just for now. Not just until you find something better. Stay because this is where you belong." Before Eliza could answer, before she could even process what he was asking, a sharp knock sounded at the door. They both froze. It was full dark, well past the hour when anyone respectable would come calling. Cullen rose slowly, his hand moving automatically to the rifle that hung above the door. "Stay back," he said quietly. He opened the door a crack, his body blocking most of the opening. "Help you?" "Cullen Reyes?" The voice was unfamiliar to Eliza, rough and slightly slurred with drink. "Got business with you." "Kind of business comes calling this time of night?" Cullen's voice had gone flat, dangerous. "The kind about your new wife? Or is she your whore? Hard to tell with a woman bought at auction." Eliza's blood went cold. She recognized that voice now, Walt Granger, the man who'd bid against Cullen in the market square. "Get off my property." Cullen's voice was lethal quiet. "Now, don't be hasty." Granger's words ran together slightly. "I'm here to make you an offer, reasonable offer. I'll give you $200 for the woman, $50 more than you paid. That's good profit for less than a month's work." Eliza felt the room tilt around her. Of course this was what she was. Property to be bought and sold, traded and bargained over. She'd let herself forget that for a moment. Let herself believe that Cullen's words about family and belonging meant something more than... "She's not for sale." Cullen's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "Everything's for sale at the right price. $250. That's my final offer." "And I said no." There was movement in the doorway, Cullen's shoulders shifting. "Now you can leave walking, or I can help you leave another way. Your choice." "You're being unreasonable, Reyes. Woman can't even give you children. What good is she? Just a mouth to feed, taking up space that could..." Eliza didn't see Cullen move. One moment he was in the doorway, the next there was a solid thud of flesh hitting flesh, and Granger's voice cut off with a grunt of pain. Cullen's voice came low and vicious. "You ever talk about her that way again, you'll be eating through a straw for a month. Understand me? Christ, Reyes, there's no call for understand me?" A pause, then a sullen, "Yeah, I understand." "Good. Now get the hell off my land before I forget I'm a Christian man." Footsteps stumbled away into the darkness, followed by the sound of a horse being mounted and ridden off with more speed than grace. Cullen stood in the doorway for a long moment, his breathing harsh, before closing and barring the door. When he turned, there was blood on his knuckles. "Let me see your hand," Eliza said, finding her voice. "It's fine. It's bleeding. Let me see it." He crossed to her slowly, and she took his hand gently, examining the split skin across his knuckles. It wasn't deep, but it would need cleaning. She fetched water and clean cloth, and tended to his hand while he stood silent and rigid, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle jumping. "I'm sorry," he said finally, "that you had to hear that." "It's nothing I haven't heard before." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Samuel's family used to say worse, right to my face. They were wrong. He's wrong." Cullen's free hand came up to grip her shoulder, making her look at him. "You're not worthless. You're not just a mouth to feed. You're..." He stopped, seemed to be wrestling with words. "You're the first person in 2 years who's made this house feel like a home again. You're the reason my children smile. You're the reason Lila's still breathing. And if Walt Granger or anyone else thinks I'd trade that for any amount of money, they can go straight to hell." Eliza stared at him, her throat too tight for words. His hand was warm on her shoulder, his eyes fierce and certain, and she wanted desperately to believe him, wanted to believe she could be worth something to someone. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care so much?" "Because..." Cullen stopped, and something shifted in his expression, something raw and almost frightened. "Because when I look at you, I don't see someone broken. I see someone strong enough to keep standing after the world tried to knock her down. I see someone gentle with my children when she could have been bitter. I see someone who fights for people who aren't even hers to fight for." His thumb brushed her collarbone almost unconsciously. "I see someone I don't want to lose." The words hung between them, trembling with possibility and danger. Eliza could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could feel the warmth of his hand through her dress, could feel everything she'd carefully locked away threatening to break free. "Cullen, I know." He pulled his hand back, stepped away, put safe distance between them. "I know it's too soon. I know I have no right to. You've been here barely 2 weeks. You barely know us. But I needed you to know that you're not property here. You're not something I bought. You're—" He rubbed his face with his uninjured hand. "You're just Eliza, and that's enough. More than enough." She wanted to tell him that she felt it too, this thing growing between them. Wanted to tell him that when he'd held her hands this morning, she'd felt safer than she'd felt in years. Wanted to tell him that his children had already claimed pieces of her heart she'd thought were dead forever. But the words stuck in her throat, tangled up with fear and old wounds and the certainty that anything this good couldn't possibly last. "Thank you," she said instead, for defending me, for not— "Don't thank me for basic decency." His voice was gruff. "You deserve that and more." They stood there in the firelight, the air between them charged with everything unsaid, until finally Cullen cleared his throat. "I should sleep. Long day tomorrow." "Yes, of course." He moved toward his bedroom, then paused at the door. "Eliza, what I said about staying, I meant it. Think about it." "I will," she promised, and watched him disappear into the dark room, the door clicking shut behind him. She lay awake on her bed by the fire for a long time that night, her mind spinning through everything that had happened. Lila's fever, Cullen's hands on hers, his fierce defense against Granger, the raw emotion in his voice when he'd asked her to stay. She thought about the children sleeping in the next room, about the way they'd started calling her Mrs. Hart instead of ma'am, about the way Thomas had stopped glaring at her and started asking her opinion on things. She thought about the garden patch behind the house, waiting for someone to bring it back to life. She thought about belonging. Somewhere in the deepest part of night, she made her decision. But she kept it to herself, holding it close like a secret, waiting for the right moment to speak it aloud. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of ordinary days that felt anything but ordinary to Eliza. Lila recovered fully, bouncing back with the resilience of childhood, and the house settled into its rhythm again. But something had shifted, something fundamental in the way Cullen looked at her, in the way his hand would brush hers when they passed in the narrow kitchen, in the way he sought her opinion on matters large and small. And then came the day he announced they needed supplies from town. "Sage Bend's a fair ride," he said over breakfast. "I'll take the wagon, be back by evening. Thomas, you're in charge while I'm gone." "I could come with you," Eliza offered, before she could think better of it. Cullen looked up sharply. "You sure? Sage Bend's bigger than Red Hollow. More people. More—" He didn't finish, but she understood. More chance of running into people who knew her story. More chance of humiliation. "I'm sure," she said firmly. "We need fabric for the children. Ruth's growing out of her dresses, and Lucas needs new shirts. I should pick it out myself." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "All right. We leave in an hour." The ride to Sage Bend took most of the morning, the wagon rattling over rutted roads while the sun climbed higher. They talked little, but it was a comfortable silence, and Eliza found herself watching the landscape change. The high desert giving way to slightly greener country, the distant mountains purple against the blue sky. Sage Bend was indeed bigger than Red Hollow, with a proper main street lined with shops and a hotel, and even a small church with a white steeple. People moved along the wooden sidewalks, going about their business, and Eliza felt her shoulders tense automatically, waiting for the stares and whispers. But nobody knew her here. Nobody cared. Cullen helped her down from the wagon in front of the general store, his hand steadying her elbow. "I need to see about some hardware. Meet you back here in an hour?" That should be enough time. She watched him stride away toward the feed store, his long legs eating up the distance, then turned and pushed open the door to the general store. A bell jangled overhead, cheerful and bright. The store was dim after the bright sunlight outside, filled with the mingled smells of coffee and leather and the sharp tang of pickle brine. Behind the counter stood a woman of middle years, her graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, her smile welcoming. "Help you, miss?" "I need fabric," Eliza said, "for children's clothes, and thread, and needles if you have them." "Sure do. Right this way?" Eliza lost herself in the simple pleasure of choosing. This blue calico for Ruth, this sturdy brown cotton for Lucas's shirts, this cream muslin that would make a nice dress for Margaret. She was examining a bolt of green gingham when a voice behind her made her freeze. Well, well, if it isn't the Barren bride. She turned slowly. 3 women stood behind her, dressed in their town clothes, their faces arranged in identical expressions of vicious curiosity. The one who'd spoken was younger than the other 2, with a sharp face and shrewd eyes. I heard Cullen Reyes bought himself a wife at auction over in Red Hollow, the woman continued, her voice carrying through the store. Didn't believe it at first. Seemed too desperate even for him. But here you are, shopping like a respectable woman instead of the charity case you really are. Eliza's hands tightened on the fabric. She could feel every eye in the store turning toward them, could feel the familiar burn of shame creeping up her neck. Excuse me, she said quietly, trying to step past them. Oh, don't rush off. The woman moved to block her. We're all just curious. What's it like being bought like a horse? Does he keep you in the barn with the other animals? The other women tittered. Eliza felt her breath coming short, felt the old panic rising. This was Red Hollow all over again, the mockery and cruelty, and she was trapped. That's enough, Judith Winters. The voice came from the doorway, cold and sharp as a knife. Eliza's head snapped up. Cullen stood framed in the doorway, his face carved from stone, his eyes promising violence. He crossed the store in 4 long strides and positioned himself between Eliza and the 3 women, his broad shoulders blocking their view of her entirely. Your brother Samuel annulled his marriage to Mrs. Hart because he wanted an heir, Cullen said, his voice low and dangerous. But you and I both know the real reason he couldn't have children had nothing to do with her and everything to do with him. Don't we, Judith? The woman's face went white, then red. How dare you? The whole county knows Samuel visits Dr. Pierce once a month for his treatments, Cullen continued relentlessly. Knows he was injured as a boy and can't father children, but it was easier to blame his wife than admit the truth, wasn't it? Easier to let her take the shame for his failure. Eliza stared at Cullen's back, her mind reeling. Samuel had always been, that's slander! Judith's voice shook. I'll have you arrested for... Try it. Cullen's voice could have cut glass. And I'll make sure everyone from here to Albuquerque knows exactly why your brother needed 2 wives to get what he wanted, and still failed. Now get out of this store before I forget I don't hit women. The 3 women fled, their skirts rustling with indignation and fear. Silence fell in the store, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Slowly, Cullen turned to face Eliza. His face had softened slightly, though his eyes still held that protective fury. You all right? She couldn't speak. Couldn't process what had just happened. 3 years she'd carried the blame, the shame, the certainty that her body was broken and wrong. 3 years of believing she was barren, worthless, defective, and it had been a lie. Samuel's lie. A lie he'd let her believe, let her suffer for, rather than admit his own inadequacy. Eliza. Cullen's hand came up to her face, his calloused palm cradling her cheek with heartbreaking gentleness. Breathe. Just breathe. I didn't know, she whispered. All this time I didn't... He let me think. I know. I'm sorry. His thumb brushed away a tear she hadn't realized was falling. I should have told you sooner, but I didn't know how. Didn't know if you'd believe me. How long have you known? Since before I bought you. His jaw tightened. I asked around after your father started announcing the auction. Wanted to know who you were, what your story was. Doc Pierce drinks at the saloon sometimes, talks too much when he does. The whole story came out, how Samuel had been coming to him for years trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, how he annulled the marriage rather than admit the truth. You knew, Eliza said slowly, and you paid all that money, knowing I wasn't actually... Knowing you'd been blamed for something that wasn't your fault, Cullen corrected gently. Knowing you'd spent years being punished for a lie. Yeah, I knew. And I wanted to give you a place where the truth mattered more than people's cruel assumptions. Eliza looked up at him, this man who'd paid a fortune for her, who'd defended her twice now against people who wanted to tear her down, who'd known her deepest shame was built on lies, and never said a word until she needed to hear it. This man who saw her not as barren or broken, but simply as Eliza, and found that enough. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Judith Winters is going to make trouble. Her family's got influence in Sage Bend. This might—" He stopped, shook his head. "This might make things harder for you." "I don't care." And she found to her surprise that it was true. "I don't care what they say anymore. I know the truth now. That's what matters." Something blazed in Cullen's eyes, pride maybe, or something deeper and more dangerous. His hand was still on her face, and she could feel the warmth of it, the careful strength that held her like she was something precious. "We should finish shopping," he said finally, reluctantly, letting his hand drop. "Get home before dark." They completed their purchases, the fabric, the thread, the supplies Cullen needed, and loaded everything into the wagon. But as Cullen helped Eliza onto the bench seat, his hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, and when their eyes met, something passed between them that felt like a promise. The ride home was quieter than the ride in, both of them lost in their own thoughts. But when they were still a mile from the house, Eliza finally found the words she'd been holding close since the night of Lila's fever. "I want to stay." Cullen's hands tightened on the reins. "What?" "You asked me to stay, to make this permanent. I want to." She turned to face him, needing him to see the certainty in her eyes. "I want to stay with you and the children. I want to try to grow that garden. I want to teach Ruth her letters and listen to Margaret's worries and help Thomas learn he doesn't have to carry everything alone. I want—" Her voice caught. "I want to belong somewhere, and I think maybe I could belong here, if you'll have me." The wagon rolled to a stop. Cullen set the brake with hands that weren't quite steady, then turned to face her fully. "Eliza, you need to understand what you're saying. This place is hard. The work never ends. We barely make enough to get by most years. The children, they're good children, but they're still grieving, still learning how to live without their mother. And I—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "I'm not an easy man. I'm rough around the edges. I don't have pretty words or gentle ways. If you stay, it won't be easy." "I don't need easy," Eliza said quietly. "I just need honest. I need to be somewhere I'm valued for who I am, not judged for what I can't give. And I think that's here." Cullen reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His thumb traced circles on her palm, gentle and wondering. "If you stay," he said carefully, "it won't be as hired help. It'll be as part of this family, as their—" He struggled with the words. "Not trying to replace Maria, never trying to replace her, but as someone who helps me raise them, someone who has a say in decisions, someone who matters." "I understand. Do you?" His gray eyes searched hers. "Because I need you to know I'm not asking you to be my wife. Not yet. Not until we've had time to figure out what this is between us. But I am asking you to stay, to commit to being here, being part of us. And if someday down the road we both feel, if we both want—" He shook his head. "I'm doing this badly." "You're doing fine." Eliza squeezed his hand. "I know what you're saying. You're saying stay and see. Stay and let us figure out if this can be more than just convenience and necessity. Stay and find out if maybe we could build something good here." "Yes." Relief flooded his face. "Exactly that. Then I'm staying." She smiled, small but real. "And we'll figure out the rest as we go." Cullen looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and tender warring in his expression. Then he lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, chaste but full of promise. "Welcome home, Eliza." The words settled into her chest like a warm stone, solid and certain. Home. After 3 years of being unwanted, unwelcome, a burden to be disposed of, she finally had a home. They rode the last mile in silence, but their hands stayed clasped between them on the bench seat, and when the house came into view, small and weather-beaten and perfect, Eliza felt her heart swell with something that might have been hope. The children came running when they heard the wagon, all 5 of them tumbling out of the house in a rush of questions and excitement. Did Papa get the nails he needed? Did Mrs. Hart find good fabric? Could they see? Could they help unload? And as Eliza climbed down from the wagon into the midst of them, feeling small hands grabbing at her skirt and hearing their voices overlapping in cheerful chaos, she thought, yes, this is where I belong. This is home. She didn't see Thomas watching from the porch with something like approval in his eyes. Didn't see Margaret's face light up with pure relief. Didn't see the way Cullen watched her with his children, the way his expression softened into something almost like contentment. But she felt it, felt the rightness of it, the way the pieces were starting to fit together. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Eliza allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, good things could last after all. That night, after the children were asleep, Eliza stood in the doorway watching the last light fade from the western sky. Behind her, she could hear Cullen moving through the house, banking the fire, checking the doors. The ordinary sounds of a man securing his home for the night, but they felt different now. They felt like sounds that included her, sounds that were as much hers to hear as his to make. She'd made her decision to stay, spoken it aloud, and the world hadn't ended. If anything, the world had opened up a little wider, shown her a future she hadn't dared imagine even a month ago. Eliza? She turned to find Cullen standing a few feet behind her, his hands shoved in his pockets, his expression uncertain in a way she'd rarely seen. I wanted to talk to you about practical things, about how it works going forward. All right. He gestured to the chairs by the fire, and they sat as they'd done so many nights before. But tonight felt different. Tonight they were deciding things, shaping a future instead of just surviving the present. You'll need your own space, Cullen began. Not proper, you sleeping on the floor or squeezed in with the girls much longer. I was thinking, the boys' room is bigger. I could move Thomas and Lucas in with me, give you their room. It's not much, but it's private, and no. Eliza's voice was gentle but firm. Don't make the boys give up their space. I'm fine with the girls, or I can keep sleeping out here. I don't need... You need a room. His voice had gone stubborn. You're not a servant, Eliza. You're not temporary help. If you're staying, you need a proper place that's yours. Then build me one. He blinked. What? Build me a room. An addition off the back, maybe. Something small, just big enough for a bed and a trunk. The boys keep their room, the girls keep theirs, and I have my own space. She met his eyes. And you could use the help. Teaching the boys how to frame and roof, how to square corners. It would be good for them. Cullen stared at her for a moment, then a slow smile spread across his face, the first real, unguarded smile she'd seen from him. You're a clever woman. I'm a practical woman. There's a difference. Still clever. He leaned back in his chair, his mind clearly already working through the logistics. We could do it before winter. Get it closed in and weathertight, at least. Finish the inside work when the weather turns bad and we're stuck inside anyway. He paused. You'd really be all right with that? Helping build it yourself? I'd prefer it, Eliza said honestly. I want to know how it's made, how to fix it if something breaks. I don't want to be helpless. You're not helpless. His voice was quiet but certain. But I understand wanting to be able to fix your own problems. Maria was like that too. Insisted I teach her how to shoe a horse, how to mend tack, how to load and fire the rifle. Said if something happened to me, she needed to be able to take care of herself and the children. It was the most he'd spoken about his wife in one stretch, and Eliza held very still, afraid that if she moved, he'd stop. She was tougher than she looked, Cullen continued, his eyes distant with memory. Small woman, barely came up to my shoulder, but she could outwork men twice her size. When we first came here, this place was nothing, just open land and hope. She worked right alongside me, clearing rocks, digging post holes, carrying water from the creek. Never complained, not once. You must miss her terribly. Every day. He rubbed his face with both hands. But it's different now than it was. The first year after she died, I was drowning, barely keeping my head above water. Everything reminded me of her and everything hurt. But then you came, and... He stopped, struggling with words. It still hurts. I still miss her. But it's not the only thing I feel anymore. There's room for other things now. Room for... He gestured helplessly between them. For whatever this is. I'm not trying to replace her, Eliza said softly. I couldn't even if I wanted to. She was their mother, your wife. That's sacred ground, and I won't trespass on it. I know you won't. That's part of why... He shook his head. That's part of why this works. You're not trying to be Maria. You're just being Eliza, and that's what we need. What I need. They sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling between them. Then Eliza said, Tell me about her, about Maria. The children should hear the stories, but so should I. If I'm going to help raise them, I should know who their mother was. So Cullen talked, his rough voice gentling as he remembered. He told her about meeting Maria at a church social, how she'd been wearing a yellow dress and had flowers in her hair. Told her about their courtship, conducted mostly through letters because he'd been working a ranch 2 territories over. Told her about their wedding day, how it had rained and Maria had laughed and said it was good luck. Water meant growth. He told her about the early years of their marriage, the struggle to make the ranch work, the joy of each child's birth. Told her about Maria's garden, how she'd sung Spanish songs while she worked the soil, how she'd made everything she touched feel alive and hopeful. Told her about the small kindnesses that had made up their life together. Coffee brought to him in the barn, his shirts mended before he even noticed they were torn, the way she'd wait up for him no matter how late he worked. And he told her about the end, how Maria had woken one morning with a cough, how it had worsened over 3 days until she was burning with fever and struggling to breathe, how the doctor had come too late, how Cullen had held her while she died, how her last words had been about the children. Promise me, she'd whispered. Promise me you'll find someone to love them. Don't let them grow up hard and alone. I promised her, Cullen said quietly, and then I broke that promise for 2 years because I couldn't see past my own grief. Until I saw you standing in that market square, holding your head up while the world tried to break you. And I thought maybe this was how I kept my promise to Maria. By giving someone else a chance at a family. By letting someone else help me raise these children she loved more than her own life. Eliza's throat was too tight for words. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, holding it firmly. He gripped back, and they sat like that for a long time, the fire burning down to embers, the night deepening around them. Finally, Cullen stirred. It's late. You should sleep. So should you. I will. He stood, still holding her hand, and pulled her gently to her feet. For a moment they stood very close, his rough hand cradling hers, his eyes searching her face in the dim light. Thank you, he said quietly. For listening. For staying. For being willing to help me keep my promise to her. Thank you for letting me, Eliza whispered back. He lifted her hand to his lips again, that same chaste kiss he'd given her in the wagon, and the tenderness of it made her heart ache. Then he released her and disappeared into his room, leaving her standing by the dying fire with her hand tingling where his lips had touched. The next morning brought the first real hint of autumn, a cool edge to the air, a yellow tinge to the cottonwood leaves along the creek. Cullen announced at breakfast that they'd start work on the new room that day, and the children's excitement was immediate and noisy. Can I help frame it, Papa? Thomas asked, sitting up straighter. That's the plan. You and Lucas both. Time you learned proper carpentry. What about us? Margaret's voice held barely concealed envy. You'll help Mrs. Hart with the cooking, and the young ones while we're working. Can't have everybody out building. Someone's got to keep the household running. He glanced at Eliza. Unless you want to be out there swinging a hammer? I'll do both, Eliza said. Help with the framing when you need extra hands. Keep the meals coming when I'm needed here. We'll make it work. And they did. Over the following weeks, the new room took shape in fits and starts between all the other demands of ranch life. Cullen and the boys would work for a few hours in the morning, then have to break off to tend cattle or mend fence or deal with whatever crisis arose. Eliza would join them when she could, holding boards steady while Cullen sawed, learning how to drive nails straight and true, getting splinters in her palms and dirt under her nails, and feeling more useful than she'd felt in years. Margaret turned out to have an unexpected talent for measuring and marking, her precise nature making her invaluable when it came to getting cuts exactly right. Even little Ruth helped, carrying nails in her apron pockets and fetching tools with serious concentration. The work was slow but steady, and Eliza found herself loving it. The smell of fresh-cut pine, the satisfying thunk of hammer on nail, the visible progress as walls rose and a roof took shape. This was something real, something lasting, something she was building with her own hands. But as September faded into October and the room neared completion, the weather began to turn. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. Frost silvered the ground some mornings, and Cullen began talking about needing to bring the cattle down from the high pastures before the first real snow. "It'll be close," he said one evening, studying the sky with the worried expression of a man reading bad omens. "Usually get another few weeks before winter sets in hard, but this year feels different, feels early." He was right to worry. The first snow came 3 days later. Not the light dusting that usually heralded winter's approach, but a heavy, wet snow that fell thick and fast, turning the world white in a matter of hours. Cullen worked himself ragged over the next week, trying to finish the critical outdoor work before the weather made it impossible. The new room got its roof just in time, though the inside remained unfinished. The cattle came down from the high country, thin and skittish. The last of the hay got cut and stacked in the barn, barely enough to see them through if the winter was mild, not nearly enough if it was harsh. And then, on a gray afternoon when the temperature had dropped below freezing and stayed there, Cullen came in from checking the fence line with blood soaking through his shirt sleeve. Margaret screamed. Ruth started crying. Eliza was at his side in an instant, her hands steady even as her heart hammered. "What happened?" "Barbed wire," Cullen said through gritted teeth. "Caught on a loose strand while I was mending the fence. Stupid mistake." "Sit down. Thomas, get me hot water and clean cloths. Margaret, get the needle and thread from my mending basket. Lucas, take the little ones into the other room." Her voice was calm, authoritative, and everyone moved to obey without question. Cullen sat heavily in the chair by the fire, his face gray with pain and probably blood loss. Eliza cut away the ruined shirt sleeve and examined the wound, deep but clean, running from shoulder to elbow. "It needs stitches," she said quietly. "I figured." Cullen's voice was tight. "You know how? I've sewn up worse." A lie, but not a complete one. She'd stitched up a dog once, and her grandmother had showed her the technique on a practice cloth. It was enough. It had to be enough. She worked as quickly as she dared, her hands steady even though her heart was racing. Cullen sat rigid and silent, his jaw clenched, his free hand gripping the chair arm hard enough to leave marks. Margaret hovered nearby, her face white but determined, handing Eliza things before she could ask for them. "Almost done," Eliza murmured. "You're doing well." Liar, but there was a ghost of humor in his voice. "I'm white as a sheet and trying not to pass out." "Then you're doing better than I would be." She tied off the last stitch and sat back, her hands trembling now that the crisis was past. "There. It's going to hurt for a while, and you need to keep it clean and dry. No heavy work for at least a week." "Can't afford a week off." "You can't afford blood poisoning either." Eliza's voice went hard. "Thomas and I can handle the essential work. The rest can wait." "Thomas is 10 years old. Thomas is capable and willing, and you need to learn to delegate before you work yourself to death." She caught his eyes, held them. "You have people to help you now. Let us help." Cullen stared at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then he nodded, once, sharp with reluctant acceptance. "All right, but if—" "No buts. You rest. We work." Simple as that. Over the next week, Eliza discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed. She and Thomas made a surprisingly effective team, her planning and his young but capable hands managing to keep the essential work done. They fed the animals, hauled water, chopped wood, checked the fence lines. Lucas helped where he could, and even Margaret took on extra tasks, managing the younger children in the household while Eliza was outside. Cullen chafed at the forced inactivity, but his arm was healing clean and true, and he grudgingly admitted that maybe he had been pushing himself too hard. "You're good at this," he said one evening, watching Eliza come in from evening chores, her cheeks red with cold, and her hair escaping its braid. Running things, making decisions, leading. I'm just doing what needs doing. That's what leadership is. He shifted in his chair, wincing slightly as the movement pulled at his stitches. Maria used to say that too, just doing what needs doing. But it's more than that. It's seeing what needs doing and doing it without being asked. That's rare. Eliza hung up her coat, suddenly self-conscious under his steady gaze. Thomas did most of the work. I just pointed him in the right direction. You taught him to think for himself, to assess a situation and make good choices. That's worth more than any amount of manual labor. Cullen's voice went quiet. He's growing up, Eliza. Growing into a good man, and a lot of that is because of you. He was already a good boy. Stop. Cullen's voice was gentle but firm. Stop deflecting every compliment I give you. You're allowed to be good at things. You're allowed to take credit for your work. You don't have to make yourself small. The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. How many years had she spent making herself small, making herself unobtrusive, trying to take up as little space as possible so people might forget she was there and stop being cruel? How many years had she apologized for existing? I don't know how to do anything else, she admitted quietly. Then learn. Cullen stood carefully, crossed to where she stood. Learn to stand tall. Learn to speak up. Learn to believe that you matter, because you do, Eliza. You matter to me. You matter to these children. You matter in ways I don't think you even realize yet. He was close enough that she could feel the heat of him, could smell the familiar scent of leather and soap and something that was just Cullen. Her breath caught in her throat. I'm trying, she whispered. I know you are. His good hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with devastating gentleness. And I see it. I see you getting stronger every day. See you standing a little taller, speaking a little louder. See you becoming who you were always meant to be, before the world tried to break you. Eliza closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. This man who saw her really saw her in ways no one ever had before. This man who defended her, trusted her, believed in her even when she couldn't believe in herself. Cullen, Papa? Thomas's voice from the doorway made them both jump apart. Sorry, I didn't mean to. The wind's picking up something fierce. Think we should bring the horses in closer to the barn? Cullen cleared his throat, his hand dropping from Eliza's face. Yeah, good thinking. I'll come help. You'll stay here and rest that arm, Eliza said firmly. Thomas and I will handle it. Won't we, Thomas? The boy's eyes moved between them, understanding flickering in his expression. Then he nodded. Yes, ma'am. We'll handle it. They worked together in the gathering dusk, moving the horses into the shelter of the barn as the wind picked up and the temperature dropped further. Thomas didn't speak much, but when they were done and heading back to the house, he said quietly, He's happier now, since you came. Eliza looked at him in surprise. What? Papa, he's happier, smiles more. Smiles? Doesn't get that look like he's somewhere else, somewhere sad. Thomas kicked at a clump of snow. I know I was mean to you at first. I was angry, felt like you were trying to replace Mama. Thomas. But you're not, he continued. You're Eliza. And that's good. That's what we need. What he needs. He looked up at her, his young face serious. I'm glad you stayed. Eliza's throat went tight. I'm glad I stayed too. They walked back to the house together, and when they came through the door, stamping snow from their boots, Cullen looked up from his chair with an expression of such warmth and gratitude that Eliza had to look away before she started crying. That night, as she lay in her makeshift bed by the fire, her new room still unfinished inside, not yet ready for occupation, she thought about Cullen's hand on her face, about the way he'd looked at her like she was something precious. Thought about Thomas's words, about being what they needed. Thought about how terrifyingly easy it would be to fall completely in love with this family. The storm that had been threatening broke 2 days later with a vengeance. Snow fell for 3 days straight, piling up against the house and barn, turning the world into an endless white expanse. They were trapped inside, all 7 of them, and the house felt simultaneously too small and exactly right. They passed the time as best they could. Eliza taught the children more letters, and Thomas surprised everyone by teaching himself to read simple words. Margaret worked on her sewing, creating a sampler with careful stitches. Lucas carved wooden animals with his pocket knife, his tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. The little ones played elaborate imaginary games that involved every blanket in the house and most of the furniture, and Cullen watched over all of it with something like peace on his weathered face. On the third night of the storm, when the children were finally asleep and the howling wind was the only sound, Eliza found herself standing at the window watching the snow fall. Behind her, she heard Cullen approach, his steps careful and quiet. "Penny for your thoughts," he said softly. "I was thinking about gardens," Eliza admitted, "about spring and growing things. About whether that stubborn patch of dirt behind the house will accept seeds if I'm stubborn enough to plant them." "It will," Cullen said with certainty. "You could make anything grow. I've seen your determination. You have too much faith in me." "Not possible." He moved to stand beside her, both of them watching the snow paint the world white. "Eliza, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." Her heart stuttered. "All right. Are you happy here?" His voice was careful, almost hesitant. "I know it's not what you probably dreamed of when you were a girl. It's hard work and isolation and 6 other people demanding your attention every minute. Do you feel trapped?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "I've been trapped before. This isn't that. This is..." She struggled for words. "This is the first time in my life I've felt like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Does that make sense?" "Yeah." His voice had gone rough. "Yeah, it makes perfect sense." They stood in silence for a moment, shoulders almost touching, watching the storm. Then Cullen said very quietly, "I'm falling in love with you, Eliza Hart." The world tilted. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. "What?" "I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other, really. But I need you to know. Need you to understand that what's between us, it's not just convenience for me. It's not just gratitude or practicality or Maria's dying wish. It's you. The way you hum when you're cooking. The way you get that fierce look on your face when one of the children needs defending. The way you're not afraid of hard work or hard truths. The way you stand a little taller every day, like you're finally remembering that you're allowed to take up space in the world." Eliza turned to face him fully, her heart hammering so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Cullen, I'm not asking you to love me back," he said quickly. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. I just needed you to know. Needed to be honest about what I'm feeling so you can decide, so you can choose, with all the information, whether you want to stay. I already told you I'm staying. I know, but that was before. He stopped, ran his hand through his hair in frustration. "I don't want you to stay because you have nowhere else to go. I want you to stay because you want to be here, with me, with us, as more than just help, as family, as..." He took a deep breath. "As my wife. Someday, if you'll have me." Eliza stared at him, this rough, honest, impossibly kind man who'd pulled her out of the worst moment of her life and given her a home and a purpose, and now this precious, terrifying gift of love freely offered. "I can't have children," she said, the old shame rising automatically. "You know that's not true, but even if it's not my fault, what if I still can't? What if..." "I told you before. I have 5 children, don't need more. What I need is a partner, someone to share this life with, someone who'll stand beside me when things get hard and laugh with me when things are good. Someone who sees me, really sees me, and stays anyway." "I see you," Eliza whispered. "I see you trying so hard to keep everything together. See you loving your children with everything you have. See you being gentle when the world expects you to be hard. See you choosing kindness even when it costs you. Then you see me better than most." His hand came up again, cupping her face like it was something fragile and precious. "And I see you too. See you growing into the woman you were always meant to be. See you healing from wounds that should have broken you. See you choosing to love people who aren't even yours to love. And I think if you can do that, if you can be that brave, then maybe I can be brave too." Brave enough to ask you to marry me, for real this time. Not as a transaction or a convenience, but as equals, as partners, as people who choose each other. Eliza felt tears streaming down her face, but for once they weren't tears of pain or shame. They were tears of something so big and overwhelming she didn't have a name for it, something that felt like hope and fear and joy all tangled together. "I'm afraid," she admitted. "I'm afraid I'll wake up and this will all be gone, that you'll change your mind or realize I'm not worth it, or—" "You're worth it," Cullen said fiercely. "You're worth everything. And I'm not changing my mind. I'm all in, Eliza, completely, if you'll have me." She looked up at him, this man who'd bought her freedom and given her dignity and now offered her love. Looked at his scarred hands and storm-gray eyes and the face that had learned to smile again because of her. And she made her choice. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll be your wife and their mother and your partner in all of this. I'll stay and build that garden and raise those children and love you with everything I have. Yes." Cullen's face transformed, joy breaking across it like sunrise. He pulled her close, his good arm wrapping around her, and kissed her forehead, her cheeks, finally her mouth, gentle and reverent and full of promise. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside, in that small house on the broken ridge, two wounded people chose each other and chose hope, and chose to believe that maybe, just maybe, broken things could be mended into something even stronger than before. When they finally pulled apart, both of them slightly breathless, Eliza laughed, a sound of pure, uncomplicated happiness that surprised them both. "What?" Cullen asked, smiling down at her. "I was just thinking, all those people who said I was worthless because I couldn't have children, and here I am about to become mother to 5. That's not nothing. That's everything," Cullen corrected, pulling her close again. "And they're lucky to have you. We all are." They stood wrapped in each other's arms while the snow fell and the fire burned low and the children slept safely in their beds, and Eliza thought, This is what home feels like. This is what love looks like. This is what I was waiting for all along." And for the first time in 3 years, she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. The storm broke on the 4th day, leaving behind a world transformed. Snow lay thick and pristine across the ridge, softening the harsh lines of the landscape, making everything look clean and new and full of possibility. Eliza stood at the window watching the sunrise over the white expanse, Cullen's arm warm around her shoulders, and felt something settle deep in her chest, something that felt like peace. "We should tell the children," Cullen said quietly. "About us, about the wedding." "Are you sure they're ready?" Eliza turned to look up at him. "Thomas is just starting to accept me. What if this is too much, too fast?" "They'll be happy." His voice held absolute certainty. "They've been waiting for this, even if they didn't know it, waiting for permission to love you the way they already do." The children woke to the smell of fresh biscuits and bacon, and gathered around the table with sleep-rumpled hair and curious expressions. Cullen waited until everyone was settled before clearing his throat. "Your father and I have something to tell you," Eliza said, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. 5 pairs of eyes fixed on them with varying degrees of hope and worry. Margaret's face was carefully blank, as if she was afraid to hope. Thomas looked wary. The younger ones just looked curious. "Mrs. Hart and I are getting married," Cullen said simply. "She's going to be my wife. You're—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She won't replace your mother. No one could do that. But she'll be here, permanent, as part of this family. And if you're willing, she'll be your mama. Not instead of the mama you had, but alongside her memory." Silence stretched for a long moment. Then Ruth, bless her honest heart, said, "Does that mean she won't leave? Ever?" "Never," Eliza promised, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm staying forever." "Can I call you Mama?" Ruth asked, her small face serious. Eliza's eyes filled with tears. "If you want to." "I want to." Ruth scrambled out of her chair and threw herself at Eliza, small arms wrapping tight around her waist. "I want to so much." Lila was next, sliding off her chair and joining Ruth, both girls clinging to Eliza like she might disappear if they let go. Margaret stood more slowly, her eyes bright with unshed tears, and crossed to wrap her arms around all of them. "Thank you," Margaret whispered against Eliza's shoulder. "Thank you for staying. Thank you for choosing us." Lucas hovered uncertainly, then stepped forward and patted Eliza's arm with awkward affection. "That's good," he said gruffly. "Real good." Only Thomas remained at the table, his face unreadable. Eliza met his eyes over the heads of his sisters, her heart aching. She couldn't force him, couldn't demand his acceptance. She could only wait and hope that someday. Thomas stood, walked around the table, and without a word wrapped his gangly arms around his father and Eliza both, his face pressed against Cullen's shoulder. "I'm glad, Papa," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Mama would be glad too. She'd like Mrs. Hart, like Eliza. She'd want this for us." Cullen's arm came around his son, pulling him close, and for a moment the three of them stood together while the younger children clustered around their legs, and Eliza thought, This is what it means to be chosen. This is what family feels like." They married 3 weeks later in the small church in Sigebend, with the minister's wife and the blacksmith standing as witnesses. Eliza wore a new dress made from the green gingham she'd bought that day in town. Margaret and the girls had helped her sew it, their stitches careful and proud. Cullen wore his best shirt and his one good jacket, and when he took her hand in front of the minister, his grip was steady and sure. "I, Cullen Reyes, take you, Eliza Hart, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to honor you, protect you, stand beside you in good times and bad. I promise to see you, really see you, every day for the rest of my life. And I promise that you'll never be alone again." The vows weren't traditional, but they were true, and that was what mattered. Eliza's voice shook when she spoke her own promises, but the words came from her heart. "I, Eliza Hart, take you, Cullen Reyes, to be my husband. I promise to stand with you, work beside you, help you carry whatever burdens come. I promise to love your children as my own and honor the memory of the woman who came before me. And I promise that this family, this life, this home we're building, I promise I'll fight for it with everything I have." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Cullen kissed her gently, reverently, and the children cheered. It was simple and small and perfect, and Eliza felt joy so pure and overwhelming that she laughed through her tears. They rode home in the wagon, all 7 of them crowded together under blankets against the November cold, and when they crested the rise and saw the house waiting for them, their house now, officially and completely, Eliza felt her heart swell. That night, after the children were asleep and she and Cullen sat together by the fire, in the house that was now undeniably theirs, he said quietly, "I have something for you." He pulled out a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by age and handling. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was a ring, simple silver with no stone but polished to a soft shine. "It was Maria's," Cullen said, "her grandmother's before that. She made me promise. Before she died, she made me promise that if I ever found someone else, someone good enough to love our children, I'd give them this ring." His voice was rough with emotion. She said it was a blessing, not a curse, said whoever wore it next would carry her blessing forward. Eliza's hands trembled as she took the ring. It was warm from Cullen's pocket, warm from his hands, and when she slipped it on her finger, it fit perfectly, as if Maria herself had measured it for her. "I'll honor it," Eliza promised. "I'll honor her memory and her children and everything she built here." "I know you will." Cullen pulled her close, and they sat wrapped in each other's arms while the fire burned low, 2 people who'd been broken finding wholeness in each other. Winter settled in hard after that, the kind of winter that tested everything: livestock, structures, human endurance. The snow piled high against the house. The wind howled through every crack and crevice. The cattle grew thin despite the rationed hay, and more than once Cullen came in from checking them with worry etched deep in his face. But inside the house, something else was growing. Thomas started speaking more freely, sharing his thoughts and worries instead of carrying them alone. Margaret relaxed into being a child again, letting Eliza carry the weight she'd been shouldering for too long. The younger children bloomed under the certainty that their family was complete and permanent. And Eliza discovered that she was strong in ways she'd never known. Strong enough to help birth a calf in a snowstorm at midnight. Strong enough to nurse Cullen through a bout of fever that scared her more than she'd admit. Strong enough to stand between Thomas and a panicked horse, her voice calm and sure until the animal settled. Strong enough to be exactly who this family needed her to be. But the real test came in late January when they were running dangerously low on supplies, and Cullen announced he'd have to make a run to Sage Bend. "I'm coming with you," Eliza said immediately. "It's too cold." "I'm coming." Her voice held that firmness he'd learned not to argue with. "We need fabric for the children's summer clothes, and I want to pick it out myself. Besides," she met his eyes steadily, "I'm not hiding anymore. I'm Mrs. Reyes now. Let them see it." So they made the trip together, the wagon runners fitted with makeshift skids to handle the packed snow. The children stayed home in Thomas's capable supervision. He was nearly 11 now, old enough and responsible enough to manage for a day. Sage Bend was half buried in snow, the main street quiet, most people staying inside near their fires. But word traveled fast in small towns, and by the time Eliza and Cullen reached the general store, a small crowd had gathered. At the center of it stood Judith Winters, Samuel's sister, her face pinched with cold and malice. "Well, well," she said loudly as they approached, "if it isn't the auction bride, all dressed up like a respectable woman. Tell me, Mrs. Reyes, does your husband know what he really bought? Does he know your bar—" "Finish that sentence, and I'll finish it for you," came a voice from the crowd. An older woman stepped forward, Mrs. Henderson, the one who'd helped with the children before Eliza came. "We all know the truth now, Judith. Your brother's the one who couldn't have children, and he let this poor woman take the blame for years. That makes him a coward, and you an accomplice." "How dare you?" "I dare because it's the truth." Another woman joined Mrs. Henderson, someone Eliza didn't recognize. Dr. Pierce confirmed it himself when he got drunk at Christmas and started talking. Your brother paid him to keep quiet, paid him to let his wife be blamed. The crowd murmured, shifting. Judith's face went white, then red. "Samuel will sue you all for slander. Let him try." Cullen's voice was quiet, but carried absolute authority. "Let him stand up in front of a judge and explain why he paid a doctor to lie. Let him explain why he let his wife be publicly humiliated for his failings. I'm sure that'll go real well for his reputation." Judith opened her mouth, closed it, then turned and fled down the street, her skirts kicking up snow. The crowd began to disperse, and Eliza stood there trembling, not with fear but with something else, with vindication, with relief, with the stunning realization that she'd just been publicly defended by people who barely knew her. Mrs. Henderson approached, her weathered face kind. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for those children longer," she said to Eliza. "But I'm glad they have you now. Cullen chose well." "Thank you," Eliza managed. They completed their shopping in a daze, people nodding respectfully as they passed. And on the ride home, Eliza kept touching the ring on her finger, this symbol of blessing and belonging, and thought about how far she'd come from that day in the market square. "You all right?" Cullen asked, glancing over at her. "Better than all right." She leaned against his shoulder. "I'm free. Really free. The truth is out, and I don't have to carry that shame anymore." "You never had to carry it. It was never yours." "I know that now." She smiled up at him. "I know a lot of things now that I didn't know then." Spring came late that year, but fierce when it finally arrived, the snow melting in rushing torrents, the creek swelling to a roar, the world turning green almost overnight. And Eliza, true to her word, attacked that stubborn garden patch with determination that bordered on fury. She hauled rocks, broke up the hard-packed soil, mixed in what little manure they could spare from the animals. She saved seeds from their winter vegetables, traded with neighbors for others. She worked that soil until her hands were permanently stained and her back ached constantly, and Cullen would find her there at dawn and again at dusk, coaxing life from dirt that had been dead for 2 years. "It's not going to grow," Thomas said one evening, watching her water the bare rows with precious water carried from the creek. "Mama tried for years and barely got anything. The soil's too poor, the water's too scarce." "Then I'll be poorer and scarcer," Eliza said stubbornly. "But something's going to grow here. I'll make it." And somehow, impossibly, things did grow. First the beans, pushing up through the soil with stubborn determination that matched her own. Then tomatoes, their vines clinging to the stakes Cullen had built. Squash sprawled across the ground, and lettuce came up in neat green rows, and suddenly that dead patch of earth was alive with possibility. The children helped tend it, each claiming their own small section. Ruth planted flowers along the edges, wild ones she dug up from the creek banks, transplanting them with solemn care. Lila grew peas, training them up strings with patient attention. Margaret cultivated herbs, her precise nature perfect for the delicate work. And in the center, in the spot that got the most sun, Eliza planted one precious tomato seedling that Cullen had gotten from a farmer in Sage Bend. She tended it like it was made of glass, watering it carefully, protecting it from wind and hail, whispering encouragement to it on the days when it looked like it might give up. But summer brought its own challenges. The drought came hard and mean, the kind of drought that turned the grass to straw and dried up creek beds and made every day a fight for survival. The cattle grew gaunt. The water level in the well dropped lower and lower. Cullen rationed everything, his face growing more lined with worry as the weeks passed without rain. "We might lose them," he said one night, his voice hollow. "The cattle. Maybe the ranch. I don't know how we'll make it through if this doesn't break soon." "We'll make it," Eliza said with more confidence than she felt. "We've survived worse. We'll survive this." But even she felt her faith wavering as July turned to August and the heat pressed down like a physical weight. The garden began to wilt despite her desperate efforts to keep it watered. The beans dried up on their vines. The lettuce bolted and died. One by one, her carefully tended plants succumbed to the relentless sun and the lack of water. Until only one thing remained, that single tomato plant stubbornly clinging to life, one green fruit hanging heavy on its stem. Eliza checked it every morning and every evening, her heart in her throat. It was smaller than it should be, stunted by the harsh conditions, but it was alive. It was growing. It was a tiny, imperfect miracle in the midst of catastrophe. And then Cullen collapsed. It happened in the field, in the brutal afternoon heat. Thomas came running, his face white with panic, and Eliza was there in minutes, dropping to her knees beside her husband's unconscious form. He was burning with fever, his skin dry and hot, his breathing shallow. "Help me get him inside," she ordered Thomas. "Margaret, get water, as much as we can spare. Lucas, Ruth, stay out of the way. Lila, get me clean cloths." They worked together, the whole family moving with practiced efficiency, and got Cullen into bed. Eliza stripped off his sweat-soaked shirt and began bathing him with precious water, watching his face for any sign of consciousness. He didn't wake. For 3 days he burned, lost in fever dreams where he called out for Maria, for the children, for Eliza. She sat beside him through all of it, bathing him, forcing water between his cracked lips, refusing to let him go. The children took turns sitting with her, their young faces grave with worry. On the third night, as the fever finally began to break, Cullen opened his eyes and focused on her face. His voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "Eliza, I'm here." She took his hand, her own voice shaking. "I'm right here. Don't leave me." The words were plaintive, childlike, pulled from the depths of fever and fear. "Not you. Please not you." "I'm not going anywhere," she promised fiercely. "You hear me? I'm not going anywhere. You're stuck with me forever, Cullen Reyes." Something like a smile touched his cracked lips. "Good. That's good." He slept then, real sleep instead of fevered unconsciousness, and Eliza sat holding his hand and crying silent tears of relief and exhaustion and overwhelming love. He recovered slowly, stubbornly insisting on getting back to work before he was ready, and Eliza had to physically block the door to keep him in bed. They argued about it, their first real fight as a married couple, and it ended with Cullen pulling her down beside him and holding her while they both cried. For fear, for relief, for the fragility of life and the preciousness of having someone to fight with. "I thought I was going to lose you," Eliza whispered against his chest. "Takes more than a little fever to kill me." But his arms tightened around her. "Though I'll admit, it was close. Closer than I'd like. Promise me you'll be more careful. Promise me you won't work yourself to death trying to save everything." "I promise, if you promise the same." He pulled back to look at her. "I see you out there killing yourself over that garden, working from dawn to dusk when there's barely enough water for drinking. You can't save everything either, Eliza. But I have to try. Why? What are you trying to prove?" The question stopped her. What was she trying to prove? That she was useful? That she deserved to be here? That she could grow something from nothing? I need to show that I'm worth it, she admitted finally. That you didn't make a mistake choosing me, that I can give you something, even if it's just vegetables from a garden. Eliza, Cullen's voice was infinitely gentle. You already give us everything. You give us a home, not just a house. You give my children love and stability and someone who sees them as individuals. You give me partnership and companionship and love I didn't think I'd ever have again. You don't need to prove anything with a garden. But I want to. Her voice broke. I want to show that something good can grow here. That we're not barren. He understood finally. Understood that the garden was about more than vegetables. It was about proving that life could flourish in harsh conditions, that broken things could bloom again, that they, could create something beautiful out of difficult ground. Let me try, she whispered. Just let me try. So he did. And somehow, impossibly, that one tomato kept growing, kept clinging to life through drought and heat and every hardship the summer threw at it. And finally, in late August, it began to turn red. Eliza found it one morning when she went out for her daily check, and she stood there staring at the first blush of color on its skin with tears streaming down her face. It was small, imperfect, scarred from the harsh conditions, but it was real. It was red. It was ripe. She waited one more day until the tomato was fully red and heavy on the vine. Then she picked it carefully, cradling it in both hands like the miracle it was, and carried it into the house. The family was gathered at the table for breakfast. Cullen looking stronger now, his fever finally gone, the children chattering about their plans for the day. They all stopped when they saw what she was carrying. Is that? Margaret breathed. It's a tomato, Eliza said, her voice thick with emotion. From our garden, from this ground that was supposed to be too hard, too dry, too dead to grow anything. Cullen stood slowly, crossed to her, and looked down at the single red fruit in her hands. His eyes were bright with understanding. You did it. We did it. She looked around at all of them, her husband, her children, her family. We all did it. We took something that looked dead and made it live again. What do we do with it? Ruth asked practically. Eliza looked at Cullen and something passed between them. Understanding, love, shared triumph over impossible odds. We share it, she said. We cut it into 6 pieces and we share it, and we remember that we grew this together. So they did. Cullen cut the small tomato carefully, dividing it into 6 thin slices, one for each person, a perfect communion. They ate it slowly, savoring every bite, and Eliza tasted victory and vindication and the overwhelming sweetness of something earned through stubborn determination. It's good, Lucas said solemnly. Best tomato I ever had. Best tomato ever grown, Thomas corrected, grinning at Eliza. And watching her family eat the fruit of her labor, seeing the pride and love in their faces, Eliza finally understood what Cullen had been trying to tell her all along. She didn't need to prove her worth through gardens or work or endless effort. Her worth was in this, in the way Thomas smiled at her, in the way Margaret sought her advice, in the way the little ones called her mama without hesitation, in the way Cullen looked at her like she was the answer to prayers he hadn't known how to pray. She was the garden. She was the thing that had been planted in hard ground and somehow, impossibly, bloomed. The drought broke 2 days later with rain that fell for 3 days straight, soaking into the thirsty earth, filling the creek, turning the world green again. And in that rain-soaked earth, Eliza planted seeds for next year's garden, knowing that now that the ground had been broken, now that something had grown, next year would be easier. Summer faded into autumn, and autumn into winter again, and life on the broken ridge settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. The children grew and learned and thrived. The ranch recovered from the drought, and Eliza and Cullen built a life together that was messy and imperfect and absolutely beautiful. On a cold February morning, a rider came up the track, a well-dressed man with maps and ledgers representing the railroad company. He wanted to buy the ranch, he said. wanted the land for a new route they were planning. He'd pay well, he assured Cullen, more than the property was worth, enough to start over somewhere easier, somewhere more forgiving. Cullen listened politely, then walked the man outside. He pointed to the garden, dormant now but visible in its carefully tended beds, pointed to the chicken coop the children had helped build, to the new room added onto the house, to the swing hanging from the old oak tree that Eliza had insisted on. "You see all that?" Cullen asked. "That's my wife's work. Our work together. Every nail, every post, every seed planted in that ground. We did that. We made something here. Made a home out of nothing but stubbornness and hope. I understand, Mr. Reyes, but the railroad can find another route." Cullen's voice was firm. "This land, it's not for sale. Not at any price. My wife grew a tomato in ground that shouldn't grow anything. My children are learning that hard work and love can make miracles. And He looked back at the house, where Eliza stood in the doorway watching them. "I finally understand what my first wife was trying to tell me before she died. That home isn't a place you find. It's something you build, together, one stubborn day at a time." The railroad man left disappointed, and Cullen walked back to where Eliza waited. "You told him no." "I told him we're not for sale." He took her hands. "None of this is for sale. Not the land, not our life, not what we've built here." "Good." Eliza smiled up at him. "Because I have plans for that garden come spring. Big plans." They went inside together, and that afternoon Cullen carved something into the beam above the fireplace, letters cut deep and sure. "She did not bear my blood, but she gave birth to the rest of my life." Eliza cried when she saw it, and Cullen held her while the children clustered around asking what was wrong, and she had to explain that sometimes people cried because they were happy, because they'd been given something so precious they couldn't hold it all inside. Years passed. The children grew tall and strong, and eventually left home. Thomas to work a neighboring ranch, Margaret to marry a good man from Sage Bend, Lucas to try his hand at teaching in the new schoolhouse. The younger ones followed in their time, building their own lives, their own families. But they came back. They always came back. Came back for holidays and harvests, came back with spouses and babies, came back to the place where they'd learned that family wasn't just blood. It was choice and love and stubborn determination to keep showing up. And the garden grew. Every year it grew a little bigger, a little more abundant, until it sprawled across half the yard in a riot of tomatoes and beans and squash and flowers. Neighbors came to marvel at it, asking Eliza her secrets, and she'd just smile and say, "Stubbornness," and refusing to believe that hard ground means nothing will grow. On a spring morning when Eliza was old and gray, her body worn down by years of hard work, but her spirit still fierce and bright, she stood in that garden and looked at everything she'd grown. Not just vegetables, but a life, a family, a home, a legacy of love planted in impossible soil and nurtured into something beautiful. Cullen found her there, his own hair silver now, his face lined but softened by decades of happiness. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and they stood together looking at the fruit of their stubborn hope. "No regrets?" he asked softly. "Not one." She leaned back against him. "Not a single one." "Not even that day in the market square?" "Especially not that day." She turned in his arms to face him. "Because that day was the worst day of my old life and the first day of my new one. That was the day I was bought. And the day I chose to stay. The day everything changed." "You changed everything," Cullen corrected. "You took a broken family and made us whole again. Took dead ground and made it bloom. Took a man who'd forgotten how to hope and taught him to believe in second chances." They stood there in the garden while the sun rose higher and the world woke around them. Two people who'd been sold and bought and broken and remade, who'd chosen each other and chosen hope, and chosen to believe that love could grow anywhere, even in the hardest, most unforgiving ground. When Eliza died, years later, they buried her under the oak tree at the edge of the garden, the one with the swing still hanging from its branches. Her headstone, carved by Thomas and Cullen together, read, "Here grew everything she was never given, and all that she gave anyway." Cullen joined her there in time, his stone placed beside hers with words even simpler. He saw her worth when the world could not. And the garden kept growing. Their children tended it, and their grandchildren after them, and every generation that followed knew the story of the woman who'd been sold at auction and the man who'd bought her freedom. Knew the story of the tomato that shouldn't have grown but did anyway. Knew the story of two broken people who built something whole. The old house still stands on the broken ridge, weathered but solid, surrounded by what locals call Eliza's garden, a sprawling, wild, abundant testament to the power of stubborn hope. Above the front door, carved deep into the wood where wind and weather can't erase it, are the words Cullen hung there on their 20th anniversary. Not for sale. And beneath it, added by their children after both were gone, this land, this love, these lives, built by two people who refused to believe that broken things couldn't be made beautiful. Here they prove that the hardest ground can grow the deepest roots, and that love, real, chosen, stubborn love, can bloom anywhere. Even in a woman the world called barren. Even in soil too hard to break. Even in hearts too hurt to hope. They planted something here that will grow forever. Travelers still stop sometimes, drawn by the riot of vegetables and flowers spilling over fences and climbing up walls. They ask about the garden, about how anything grows so abundant in such harsh country. And if they're lucky, someone will tell them the story of Eliza Hart Reyes, the woman who was sold like livestock and became the mother of a legacy, not through the children of her body, but through the stubborn, fierce, unbreakable love she planted in impossible ground and refused to let die. That's how it ends. That's how the story of the auction bride becomes the story of the garden maker, the story of worthlessness transformed into worth beyond measure. That's how a woman who couldn't bear children gave birth to an entire way of seeing the world, as a place where nothing is too broken to mend, no ground too hard to bloom, and no person too wounded to grow into something beautiful. And in that garden on the broken ridge, where tomatoes still grow fat and red despite the harsh conditions, where beans climb stubborn up their poles and flowers bloom in wild profusion, you can still feel it. The presence of a woman who refused to believe in barren, who saw potential in the hardest ground, who planted hope in the driest season and watered it with her tears and her sweat and her absolute unshakable faith that love could grow anywhere. If you're there at sunrise, when the dew is still on the leaves and the world is quiet, you might hear something that sounds like laughter, joyful and free and utterly triumphant. The laughter of a woman who survived being sold, who thrived in being chosen, and who proved that the measure of a life isn't in what you're given, but in what you grow from the nothing you started with. That's Eliza's gift. That's her legacy. And that's why her garden will never die, because she didn't just grow vegetables in hard ground. She grew hope itself, planted it deep, and taught everyone who came after that the most beautiful things often bloom in the places where nothing should survive. The woman they called Barren gave birth to that truth. And it's still growing, still spreading, still blooming wild and fierce and absolutely unstoppable, just like she was.